Okay, looks like we're live, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're having a fantastic Sunday. I'm going to be doing a live stream today with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald. And this should be fun because I thought for a while now, okay, Inspiring Philosophy's done talking with MythVision ever since our engagement about Dionysus, water into wine. And me and Gnostic Informant Neil did a really harsh critical video trying to get him and point out his flaws. And still to this day, I'm scratching my head going, come on, water into wine. Like it's pretty obvious to me. And we'll see this allergic reaction to imitation from anything potentially non-Jewish, non-Christian within the Christian bubble. Like they want to isolate and completely exclude. But let's go ahead and introduce Dr. Dennis MacDonald, because I wouldn't have even had a response were it not for such a well-edited, polished video. And the title itself that Inspiring Philosophy went with, Dennis would not even agree with that either. So let's start and let's have our guest join us. Dr. Dennis MacDonald, welcome.
Oh, well, thank you, Derek, so much.
Thank you. Look, this has been a fun adventure. I really am thankful for your work. It's been eye-opening over the years. I've been able to evaluate this literature in a completely different way than I ever was taught, and that was Scripture interprets Scripture, which means Scripture is all you can look to. It's like putting on certain goggles that force you to only look through their lenses. And once I found you, then I found Richard Miller, then I found like Robin Faith Walsh, then I found Bruce Loudon, then I found, and I mean, the list started to pile up of PhDs, academics with cutting edge, piercing classic / Bible scholarship overlap, which is also a unique kind of approach where not many people are trained in both areas to understanding how to navigate this material. Did you want to comment on that, or?
No, yeah, I think you got it.
Just wanted to make sure that we're on the same page. Your internet, I know, is not perfect. So what we're going to do today, ladies and gentlemen, is we're going to start with someone who gets quoted many times in this video by Michael Jones. That's Dr. Karl Olav Sandness. I want, in his own words, to express that he actually agrees, and I want everyone to remember this throughout this entire video. He thinks Homer is being used in the New Testament, in the Gospels, in Acts. He thinks it's there. Now, one, let's absolutely stillman him. He does not think as many parallels as Dennis are happening in the New Testament, but he thinks it's happening. He also doesn't agree with the hermeneutical interpretation that Dennis does, but he says Homer is being used in subtle imitation throughout the New Testament. So what I want you to notice what happens when Inspiring Philosophy uses scholars. He even quotes M. David Litwa. I don't know if he's ever even read Jesus Deus or The Evil Creator or any of his works, quoting this guy, just finding a way to go, oh, M. David Litwa said, when you look for similarities, you're parallelomania. When you look for differences, you are apologetics, which I don't know if Jones realizes that quote, which we're going to play in this video, literally works against his entire video to just point out what he's doing. It's apologetics, because there's not a single place I saw in this video where he's charitable or even thought anything you said was even remotely plausible or made any sense. He only tore everything down the best he could to make nothing of it make any sense. And that's unfortunate, because if he was more balanced, I don't know if I'd have a response or if we would even be making a critical response at all.
Well, I want the viewer to be attentive in the clips you're going to be giving from our opponents of the rhetoric of it. It's hostile. It's demeaning. It's basically saying that I'm lying and dissimulating and trying to manipulate evidence. And that's not a part of good scholarly discourse. One can disagree, but you don't demonize the opponent. And if you take a look at the rhetoric of it, it really is demeaning and unprofessional.
Well, my title's probably not the most professional either, but YouTube is also a weird world in which I do play around with these titles, and I know that they do it too. So we're all guilty of doing this. But as far as your work was considered in Karl's view, Dr. Sandness, he does take you serious. He does think that you're doing an honorable thing, even if he thinks that it might be overshooting what the New Testament is doing. So let's just get to him. I have a few timestamps from our interview the other day before we begin on reviewing Inspiring Philosophy's video. And I want you to take note of what's happening here. So let me mute while I play this.
Please. I'm not interrupting you there.
No.
Good. Yeah. I think you are right that there are many examples, and I think you are also right that the majority of the examples is subtle imitation. There are certainly instances where the imitation or the mimesis is advertised or broadcast very clearly, but mostly it is subtle. But I think, to me, there is a distinction between a Homeric embellishment of a text or matters of style and what I would call hermeneutical emulation. And I think when you, Dennis, speak, this is in your book on Mark's Gospel, when you speak about Kulturkampf, a struggle of culture, and trying to demonstrate that or argue that Jesus is presented as a hero superior to Odysseus, and that the stories told in the Gospels are superior to the stories told in Homer's epics, then there is a kind of a struggle going on, which is hermeneutical, and that demands more to me than subtle.
You're muted. You're muted.
Oh, okay, sorry. I'm skipping ahead to something I clarify to have him clarify what he means, so people understand in simple language that Karl does see what you're saying in terms of Homer being used, but where you guys disagree. And then one more clip after that, and we'll get to IP's video.
In the emulation.
Just for dummies like me who don't understand, just to break down those words you're saying, subtle and hermeneutical emulation. Can you explain to, if someone's not a scholar, what you're agreeing with him that it's subtle, but you're disagreeing on the hermeneutical side? And what does that mean?
It means that if Mark's gospel, let's talk about Mark. Let's take Mark as an example. If Mark's intention was to present Jesus as a hero superior to Odysseus and other Homeric heroes, that is hermeneutical emulation, because then the comparison with Homer has a message. It's not only about embellishing the style and so forth. It is, he is conveying a message. And if that is a message being conveyed, I expect that would somehow be flagged more.
I just want to say one thing and let him continue. Look at what just happened. Karl literally says it's there. Can you see how easily someone like MacDonald could go as far as saying, I think it's playing in some hermeneutical sense? If Karl sees it in an artistic way, he sees that it's happening. He just doesn't go as far as Dennis. Like, he's granting so much ground just now, Dennis, that Homer is there, but he's just not interpreting it that way. And so for anyone who quotes Karl to dismiss you, like, unless they take Karl's position that Homer is used in the New Testament, which IP and every one of these apologists do not do, they aren't even willing to say it's artistically there. And if they were, they would be humble, in my view, and a little more respectful on your drawing the full conclusion that you do, because, come on, I could understand why maybe if you took the stance, I could understand why MacDonald mistakenly goes as far as he does, because look, it is there. He's just going a bit too far. That's what Karl's saying. And so these apologists are taking you, trying to dismiss everything you do by going to a guy who doesn't dismiss everything that you do, who actually agrees it's there. It just doesn't work for me.
explicit than what I find.
Oh, okay,
So,
okay.
so to me, that's an important difference, and I see that Dennis maybe is agreeing on that point.
Well, I think the difference is correct. I think the difference between embellishment and hermeneutical freight, if you could put it that way, is really important.
Now you get deeper into this, and then one more clip, 2832, just to let everybody hear this and remember this when you watch what IP does. I'm just skipping ahead here to a point. Here we go.
All of MacDonald's conclusions. So this is the best part.
Oh yeah, I just said Dennis doesn't even agree necessarily with all of Dennis's conclusions. So it's not like you're a dogmatist in terms of every claim you make.
You guys talking this out. If you would, for the world who's watching right now, Dr. Sandness, can you tell us some of the examples that you personally, at the end of the night, after hearing something MacDonald says, you're sleeping in bed and you go, you know, Dennis has got a really good one right there. I think there may be something to that. Can you give us a few of those examples?
Yeah, I think I briefly mentioned Mark chapter 14. I think that's a story where I'm considering that you may be right, although I'm not fully convinced, but I'm seriously considering that as well. Mark 14 is the story about the woman who is anointing Jesus. And if I have read you correctly, Dennis, that's the text, maybe one of the most important examples also from your own point of view in Mark's gospel. And the story that may be imitated here is Odysseus 19, where Odysseus is returning home as a beggar, and no one knows who he is. But Eurycleia is asked by Penelope to wash his feet, and then she recognizes that this is her master who has returned home. A wonderful story, and I think this story is interesting because this was an iconic story in the ancient world. And by the way, I think very often people knew Homer not as texts, but more as individual stories told and as pictures and so forth.
Individual stories and pictures, art, how they visualize this. That's important when we watch what IP does in his video. But let me finish this part and then we'll get to that video, Dennis. And by the way, please butt in anytime. I feel like I'm over speaking on you, and I want you to allow you to chime in at any moment.
Okay.
So I think that maybe to me, Dennis is working too much with Homer as a text. I think they often knew it as independent stories. And this is one of the key stories that people knew. There are some interesting similarities here. But in the first place, it is a woman who is anointing and washing Jesus here. And in the third place, there is also some objections there. In the gospel, there is someone objecting to her doing this, and that has a parallel also in Odysseus 19. And then you have the name of Eurycleia. Dennis has pointed this out. This I have learned from Dennis. Eurycleia means far from glory. So there are some similarities here because that name seems to play into what Jesus says about this woman, that her memory will remain. But then
now he gets into some differences too, but we're not going in. You can watch that original video. It's in the description. But notice Karl's taking you seriously, Dennis. He's not dismissing you out of hand.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, now we need to go to the video by notice the title. Did the Gospels plagiarize Homer? Again, I'm guilty of titles, but Dennis, what do you think about that title before we even begin?
They're not plagiarizing at all. They're advertising, in fact, that they are imitating and transforming. And ancient rhetoricians and readers knew the difference. To plagiarize is to imitate and to occult your imitation. That is to hide it and to claim that you're innovative instead of recognizing the antecedent. But when you transform a model, you're not plagiarizing it, you're advertising that your position is different. And in the clips that we're going to see from our opponent, they fail to understand a very important part of Greek literature, which is called synchresis. That is a comparison of one episode, or especially one character, with another, to show that the character in the story that's now being written is superior to the hero in another story. So in an ironic way, synchresis is a form of apologetics. It's a Christian author saying that Jesus has the heroism of an Achilles. He has the wisdom of a Nestor. He has a compassion that is superior to that of Odysseus, and so on. So plagiarism is really a misunderstanding about what ancient mimesis was about, and the ancients knew the difference.
So again, it's tough what you're doing because most people don't have the knowledge, not only of the other stories. I said this in a video that I'm actually having edited right now. We have an uphill battle, 3 problems. Most people don't know their Bibles, even more don't know the Greek myths, and then way more have no clue of how rhetoricians and writers and schools operated, and their entire function, the entire modus operandi of their writing schools was imitatio, emulation, inventio, everything they did. And it wasn't just writing. This went to art. This went to literally how you ethically followed people. You literally became pupils and followers of other teachers. So how you lived your life, how you dressed, how you created art, how you wrote, how you orator, how you spoke, every aspect of human existence was mimetic, based on earlier models of canonical, famous, extremely important pictures from the Greco-Roman world.
Yeah, we don't need to overstate it. I mean, there are other things going on in ancient rhetoric too. But I think the one thing to understand is that mimesis is not theft.
Right.
Mimesis is cultural engagement. And so you're trying to transform one narrative or one image in order to show that what you're creating or what you're advocating is superior. And this is one thing the apologists don't get, that this is how early Christians are engaging with their culture to show that Jesus or Jesus is God or Paul are superior to the gods of ancient mythology. And we're going to see this over and over again in the clips, where there simply is blindness to cultural engagement and the struggle through syncresis to show that one hero is better than another.
All right, I'll start it now. We were going to cut to 11 minutes because the beginning is not getting into the parallels and dealing with the text, but let's let everyone watch it so that I don't hear anyone say, oh, you wouldn't let them see the beginning.
Could it be that you've misunderstood the entire point of the Gospels? The scholar Dennis MacDonald thinks so. Instead of the Gospels aiming to tell us about the historical Jesus, they were trying to rework the epics of Homer to create theological fiction. Jesus was modeled after characters like Odysseus and Hector from Homer's epics.
Pause me at any time you want to make a comment.
Okay.
The Gospels were never intended to be history. Mark was an artist uninhibited in his creation of theological fiction. Luke created each of these stories as fiction to imitate or emulate famous stories in the Iliad and without the benefit of pre-existing traditions. Therefore, we need to stop believing the Gospels are historical records of who Jesus was. They are just fictional works. MacDonald lists several places where he thinks the Gospels intentionally rework stories from Homer to support his theory. But when we evaluate his claims, we encounter numerous problems. There is a reason the majority of scholars who have reviewed his work come away rejecting his ideas. And as we cover some examples, you'll see why the Gospels are not theological fiction based on Homer. MacDonald claims that Mark directly imitated parts of the Odyssey and Iliad. Luke built on this and imitated more throughout his works. As noted, this was intentional. MacDonald's view is these New Testament authors were purposely reworking Homer to create fictional accounts of Jesus. He argues both Jesus and Odysseus are heroes, carpenters not honored at home but abroad, go on journeys, suffer many things at the hands of murderous usurpers, and have ignorant companions who fail the hero.
I think that, by the way, I think that's pretty interesting. When I called you recently about them both being carpenters and how significant Odysseus is as a carpenter in his story, why is it? It's just an odd overlap there specifically that made me think, okay, and they both have to suffer. They have murderous usurpers. Like, there's so many thematic elements that make you go, okay, is it coincidentally historical in the case of Jesus, but not in Odysseus? Anyway, questions arise in my head.
According to MacDonald, Mark has reworked the story of Odysseus and the Cyclops into the story of Jesus encountering the demon-possessed Gerasene, the appearance of Odysseus to Telemachus, into the Transfiguration, the meal Odysseus and his crew share before their journey to Hades, into the Last Supper, and many other stories. But since Mark's gospel ends differently than it does in the Odyssey, MacDonald claims that Mark abruptly switched to following the account of the death of Hector in the Iliad. Luke allegedly picked this up and made even more parallels in his books. MacDonald notes ancient students mainly learned to write through a process of mimesis. This is where an author would imitate an earlier work in their own unique way. This wasn't seen as plagiarizing, as many today would assume. It was rather more...
Okay, so he agreed that it's not plagiarizing, but did the Gospels plagiarize? So I guess the question is no, but he's really trying to hit home that your position is not correct.
Or about transforming earlier texts into something new. Such a practice was common among ancient students, and Homer's epics were often used. MacDonald says, imitations of Homer were common in prose as well. Students learned to imitate across genres, especially by paraphrasing epic into prose. Thus, MacDonald makes the bold claim that Mark and Luke Acts were part of this practice, and were merely imitating Homer. The earliest evangelist was not writing an historical biography, as many interpreters suppose, but a novel, a prose anti-epic of sorts. However, as noted, when MacDonald's ideas have been reviewed, scholars have found numerous issues. In fact, there are too many to cover in this video. First, MacDonald asserted that Mark expected his readers to recognize his imitations of Homer. Unless these criteria are flawed or applied inappropriately, one conclusion seems inescapable. Mark imitated Homeric epics and expected his readers to recognize it. But as Margaret Mitchell noted, it is strange this understanding has been missed for almost 2,000 years, just for MacDonald to discover the real intentions of Mark and Luke. He even acknowledges this reading has been missed. Readers for 2,000 years apparently have been blind to this important aspect of Mark's project.
Is it fair to say, by the way, Dennis, just so we're correctly understanding your current place where you've learned now, that when you wrote this, what was this, 20, 30 years ago, that at that time you did not come across like the Homeric centones and other elements that you seem to think may actually reflect knowledge or awareness by early Christians of the imitation of Homeric themes and elements in the Gospels?
That is a brilliant observation. That's exactly right. And it was in a response to Margaret Mitchell that I went through more of the patristic information and found the Homerocentones. And by the way, I'm the one who introduced Karl Olav Sandness to the centos. He did not know about them until I mentioned them. And they still, by the way, have not been thoroughly translated by anybody. They still are in ancient Greek. And by the way, and so this comes from Greek Orthodoxy. I just found out recently that an Arabic translation of Mythologizing Jesus has been approved for publication. And one of the problems we had in the publication is we couldn't find any Greek Orthodox who still would want to know about the Homerocentones. They have intentional blindness to it.
Wow.
So when we tried to find somebody in the Greek Orthodox community to translate those texts, we couldn't find them. So the Homerocentone, and I'm sure few of your readers know that those texts exist.
Can you,
and
just for our audience,
what they are rewriting of the Gospels by using Homeric lines, often in the same sequence. So when they talk about the death of Jesus, they use passages from Iliad 22 and the death of Hector. When they talk about the triumphal entry, they use 13 lines in sequence without changes of Odysseus going into the city of the Phaeacians. Later we'll talk about the Gerasene demoniac. 11 lines are intact, in sequence, without with only modest changes. These authors who are Christians and are trying to retell gospel stories return to the Homeric origins that produced those texts in the first place. So you're right, when I wrote Homeric epics in the Gospel of Mark, I was not aware of the centones. But they are extremely important because even though these Byzantine poets probably did not expect mimesis to be the result of the similarities, they undoubtedly saw the similarities.
Right. I think this is an interesting note just to add to what you're saying. Is it total coincidence that Nonus ends up having an abbreviated John, and he's the same one who writes the longest epic of Dionysus with Dionysiaca. Is that coincidence? I mean, is it coincidence you get this medieval poem by an anonymous author who literally rewrites John the Baptist, Mary, and Jesus into a Bacchic retelling? Why are they doing this? What do they see in doing this? Is that completely just coincidental that they go, I like the Bacchae. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to randomly try to rewrite this in this? Or do they see some kind of genetic code between these narratives in such a manner?
Absolutely. In fact, we've been talking about Homer, but people saw parallels to the Euripides Bacchae clearly. And you're right about the Nonus John poem. But you also have imitations of Plato, and I first discovered mimesis in Christian texts in the Apocryphal Acts of Andrew, where you have Andrew dying at the cross, strapped to it, saying he now is traveling home, like Odysseus strapped to the mast. And that just jumped out at me. And then I started to look for other possible parallels to Greek literature, and they were all over the place, including imitations of Heracles.
Just for our audience, Dennis, you are just saying how you got introduced to this. So you were reading apocryphal literature, and then you saw it, it leaped out at you, and then you started looking into the canonical literature?
I did an edition of the Acts of Andrew because at that I had to do it from Greek and Latin and Coptic, Anglo-Saxon, and Armenian, and put that text together. And I studied at the Folklore Institute at Indiana University to find out how these stories got put together, and they don't have the characteristics of oral tradition. They have characteristics of literary mimesis. And it was over 6 years before I went from the Acts of Andrew to Mark and saw that Mark was doing the same thing.
Yeah, Tony Burke really said that him reading the Acts of Andrew by your assessment of it, totally persuaded him that Homer's being used by the Acts of Andrew. Once you start seeing that, when I hear this criticism that early Christians didn't say explicitly that they were doing these things, to me, when I'm looking at the gospel developments and Luke's dependency on Mark, I see voices in those pieces of literature that are commenting and further elaborating on that earlier gospel as voices that count, in my view. What they want is an explicit advertisement. And that's unfortunate. We don't have a person go, hi, we're looking at Odysseus and Jesus is greater than, and any of that. But you're saying it's a clever interpretation that we see with all of these narratives that reflect in many ways what we see in the Homeric epics.
An advertised example of mimesis is an insult to the reader. It assumes that the reader's not going to catch on. So you don't need to say, oh yeah, the death of Andrew is similar to Odysseus at the mast. That would be an insult to the reader that you had to flag it that way.
Interesting. Okay, we'll continue.
So according to MacDonald, Mark created a theological fiction. This was evident to Luke, who built on him by imitating Homer in many other ways. But then suddenly, every church father and theologian after them missed this obvious meaning and interpreted the Gospels and Acts as intending to report history until
that tells you he's clearly relying on older works of yours, because you somewhere along the centuries you'd see the Homeric Chintones, you'd see other things,
Yeah.
Modern era. When MacDonald caught something, the overwhelming majority of experts missed for millennia. As Greg Boyd and Paul Eddy say, this problem is particularly acute, since to make his larger case, MacDonald argues that ancient authors could expect the readers to draw connections to Homer that are invisible to us. However, by his own admission, no one did. Ancient authors were aware of the practice of mimesis. Also, church fathers.
Did they write that book when, based on your Mark book?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, I'm sure.
So they didn't even know your current stuff.
Right.
Okay.
Authors like Origen, Basil, and Gregory of Nazianzus wrote extensively on the Gospels and were well acquainted with Homer. Yet they, and everyone else, just happened to miss what MacDonald suggests is the obvious reading of the Gospels. This doesn't prove
Would you want to comment on that?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
MacDonald is wrong, but circumstantially, it lowers the probability that he is correct. From the background knowledge, it is far more likely that the Gospels were never intended to be understood as imitating Homer. Second, we have real examples of mimesis from the ancient world, and everyone has been aware this is what they were intended to be. This is not the case with Mark or Luke. In the 4th century, Emperor Julian outlawed Christians from teaching the classics. Apollinarius responded by writing recreations of Old Testament narratives, so Christians could read classic-like works. Sozomen wrote, Apollinarius therefore employed his great learning and ingenuity in the production of a heroic epic on the antiquities of the Hebrews to the reign of Saul, as a substitute for the poem of Homer. He divided this work into 24 parts, to each of which he appended the name of one of the letters of the Greek alphabet, according to their number and order. He also wrote comedies in imitation of Menander, tragedies resembling those of Euripides, and odes on the model of Pindar. Empress Eudocia Athenias wrote a poem where she borrowed lines from the Iliad and Odyssey to narrate the biblical story from Genesis to Jesus. At times, she quotes Homer verbatim. Karl Olav Sandness notes, it is clear she was imitating Homer in various ways, even though many of the parallels to the gospel she made were slippery and forced. Christians knew what mimesis looked like, and no one considered Mark or Luke Acts to be obvious examples. This is a surprising fact if MacDonald is correct. Sandness draws attention to Virgil's Aeneid, an outstanding example of emulation of Homer. Macrobius noted it was common knowledge among the Romans that Virgil was imitating Homer. We can also look at Lucian's work, A True History, a satirical imitation of the practice of emulating Homer. He wrote a parody of a traveler's tale with himself as the main character, which drew heavily from the Odyssey. Throughout, Homer is not only alluded to, but directly cited. Sandness notes this is a clear example of what imitation looks like.
Real quick, I just think it's funny because literally Sandness said in our interview that there is imitation. He called it emulation, and he called it subtle. So he's not denying emulation. It's just not advertised.
And he also says that most imitation is not what does the word advertised,
right?
So that you can. It's unusual to have advertised mimesis.
But adds that in Mark's gospel, no metatextual preparation for Homer's poems, no Homeric names, no Homeric quotations are found. The crucial question is, does it make sense to speak of subtle emulation when these characteristics of the genre are all absent? There is in Mark's gospel no movement from obvious to subtle emulation of Homer's poems. This does not imply that no hypertext is advertised in Mark's gospel. This gospel does indeed advertise its hypotexts in ways that are more or less identical with both the Aeneid and the true story. But the reader is directed not to Homer, but to the Old Testament.
Okay, so he said that much in our interview that he goes, look, the immediate place that they do, the second verse of Mark, you're in the Old Testament. But here is an interesting point. He says, does it make sense to speak of subtle emulation when these characteristics of the genre are all absent? That's literally what Karl says is happening in our interview. He says there is subtle emulation. So this is a 2005 publication that he's working off of. You can see the footnote at the bottom. How do I get it here? You can see the footnote at the bottom, Imitatio Homeri. That's 2005, which means maybe Karl has come a long ways since he's written this, clearly.
I think so too. Yeah, I think so.
Wow. Okay, that's cool.
But the reader is directed not to Homer, but to the Old Testament. In other words, we have ancient examples of imitation of Homer's epics, and Mark's gospel, as well as Luke's, does not resemble the examples we have, which makes the theory unlikely. Sandness points out when an ancient text was imitating another, the author moved between advertising intertextuality and subtle emulation. This is why we know certain texts were imitating Homer. Mark and Luke never advertised intertextuality with Homer, so there is no reason to think New Testament authors were doing this. It is also surprising, if MacDonald is correct, that no Christian opponent ever brought this up. Christian opponents like Celsus and Lucian were looking for whatever they could to attack Christianity. If Mark and Luke were really imitating Homer, they could easily have dismissed the Gospels as novels that Christians mistook for historical works. But no such case was ever made. Seems like almost no one thought the Gospels were mimesis novels until MacDonald. Moreover, Loveday Alexander noted that Luke's prefaces...
Real quick, didn't these people also think that the Odyssey happened? I mean, weren't they in some way accepting these narratives as if they occurred? I'm sure there was some critical, because they had like source criticism, and like you get Josephus even commenting on this in his responses to Appian. But like, didn't they assume at least that this likely depicts what occurred? So it wasn't like it was complete fiction in their minds, right?
There's a huge debate about that, of whether the Greeks believed in their myths. I think it's one thing to say that they believed in the existence of the gods, but I think it would be difficult to imagine that they didn't think of these stories as playful works of fiction. But there is a debate on that even among classicists, and I don't think we need to walk into that.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just didn't know what your comment might be about them trying. Why wouldn't the enemies have used this as an argument to try and like pick fun at the Gospels or the Christians using Homer or something like that?
Oh, I get it. I get it. Yeah.
That's what he was trying to say.
Okay.
Do not fit with the style one would expect from an ancient epic. She adds, at the surface levels of discourse and narrative management, Acts is not an epic, and no ancient reader would suppose that it was. The evidence suggests Luke was writing a biography and a history, as his prefaces and overall writing style better fit with those genres. Has Sandness and
Okay, I'd like to talk about that.
Yeah.
Loveday Alexander is a good friend of mine.
Right.
And I respect her work. But in her work on the prologues, she makes one huge omission. The prologue to Luke Acts is closer by far to the preface of Papias's exposition. And the vocabulary is the same. Some of the issues are the same. And Papias is trying to write something as an alternative history. He is. And Luke is using that preface as well. Notice also that in the preface of Luke, he's saying he's not writing a biography. He's writing something about the things that have happened among us. And in other words, it's a founding mythology in order to take the Jesus story and to meld it with the Pauline story, which is in the Acts of the Apostles. So the prologue has a different function, and it sounds like history, and its model is actually historical. I mean, it's a history that Papias is trying to write, but it doesn't explain the genre of Luke Acts as a whole.
Right. One of those for you red flags is like a few verses later, angels are flying and doing all sorts.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Would history write that way? Right? Wouldn't they have like been a little more cautious when they go, okay, so some believe that angels flew to, or a little bit less just indulgent into the magical world of miracles like they do.
Okay, this is going further afar than I expected, but let me say this about Luke's prologue. I mean, his infancy narrative.
Okay.
The three annunciations that happened to Zechariah and Mary and the angels are all imitations of a very famous Homeric hymn called the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite that is used for the birth of Aeneas. And it's quite, Luke is advertising the similarities, and he's trying to rival Aeneas and the Roman Empire, as in Virgil's Aeneid. The dynasty that is promised to Aeneas failed with the death of Nero and was never reestablished. And Luke is trying to say that the kingdom of Jesus, as the line of David, is going to be eternal. So this is cultural engagement, not with Homer, but with Virgil. And Virgil knows and uses the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. So he is imitating the same Homeric hymn that Virgil did in order to show that Jesus is better than Aeneas. His dynasty is eternal when Aeneas's wasn't. And this is not history. This is competitive mythology. And I don't know why people haven't seen that. By the way, I still don't think any other scholar has seen those parallels with the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. But we do know that it was available and that Virgil used it.
Thank you. All right, continuing.
Sources were the Old Testament texts, which they used to connect to events from Jesus' life to show he was their fulfillment. The overwhelming majority of scholars note the Gospels have a far more prominent connection to Jewish texts than to Greek texts. If they were trying to imitate Homer, then why rely so much on the Old Testament to show Jesus was the fulfillment of the scriptures? One could merely ignore them and quote Homer extensively, as Virgil and Lucian did. But this is not what we see when we read Mark and Luke. And as noted, most scholars who have reviewed his work have thoroughly rejected MacDonald's theory. Steve Rees said, "In my view, MacDonald vastly overstates his case, which is built on dubious assertions and fallacious assumptions." Craig Keener says, "Although Homer is part of Act's larger Greco-Roman context, most critics find MacDonald's emphasis on the pervasive allusion to Homer unconvincing, especially because of his search for a single decisive hypotext, an emulation that is not recognized, and in this work, neglect for the more explicit Old Testament intertextuality in Acts." Michael F. Bird said, "MacDonald's Mark imitating Homer thesis relies on several superficial parallels. MacDonald infers that once Mark characterized Jesus as one who suffered much, like Odysseus. He then found in the epic a reservoir of landscapes, characterizations, type scenes, and plot devices useful for crafting his narrative. That is a monumentous logical and literary leap of faith."
Okay, there's so much there, Dennis.
Yeah, I don't ignore the Jewish parallels at all. If you take a look at my synopsis of epic tragedy in the Gospels, I give footnotes to every single biblical citation in the Gospels. We're not talking about simply Greek mythology or simply biblical scriptures. We're talking about a hybrid of the Christians who have their feet in two different worlds, and they use different methodologies to evoke those cultural engagements.
And just for those who don't know, I'm going to stop sharing this for a second to share this. All right. So Bruce Loudon, who's not with us, I went over some of this yesterday, Greek Myth in the Bible, this Routledge publication. In his later in the New Testament section, Luke 24 and Homer, Odyssey 3, Iliad 24, and Postponed Recognition. So on page 144, he goes in, and not only is he playing with Cleopas, which you actually written on this extensively as well, he describes how he thinks that there's a dialogic connection going on with Luke 24 and Odyssey 2 and 3, where Athena in disguise plays a pun and there's irony. Like, there's so many layers of overlap between these two narratives that he does not think that the Jewish antecedent works, because the Septuagint, when it translates, which is what Luke's using, he's not using the Hebrew, the pun that is there with Isaac laughter with Sarah and whatnot does not translate over into the Septuagint. And so there's no pun narrative. And he goes into Athena and says, look, she not only is like literally like playing with this word from fighter from afar, well, even the gods could save you from afar, to Cleopas and entering the glory of the Father, and his name meaning something about glory of the Father, and Jesus needed to do this, and he's correcting Cleopas and the disciple. You should read this. My point is, if you're a viewer watching, you should go read this. This is a whole nother scholar who knows Homer inside and out, who knows the ancient Near East inside and out, who's read this stuff and literally just supports what you're saying here, Dennis. But it talks about them suffering as a prophecy in the story, with Athena talking to Telemachus and Odysseus and all of that, pertaining to the disciples and Jesus having to suffer as well. The myths are in dialogue here. And
you can take it further. Loudon says that Homer is influencing the Greek Bible, or even the Hebrew Bible. So the Jonah story would be an example.
We're actually going to get to that too.
And there are others. Homer was used by Jews even in Semitic languages. We can see this in Tobit, and we can see it in the Greek version of Third Maccabees. Homer is the mythical oxygen that Greeks breathed.
Thank you.
Oh, by the way, I also have one other
examples.
one other thing to say. I have a friend that put my work this way to defend it. Why should we think that the Gospels are the only fish in the Homeric ocean that don't get wet? Because Homer is so pervasive, the Gospels certainly have to engage with that. That's all.
Thank you.
Hit some important ones so you can see why the scholarly community remains unconvinced. What is likely going on is the phenomenon called parallelomania, which is when someone sees apparent similarities and then constructs parallels without a logical basis or evidence of a causal link. One is merely noticing things that look similar and assuming there is more than what is there. But similarities between different things often result by mere coincidence or are constructed by writers trying to find patterns. To begin,
we have to, okay? I know we can keep going, but like I think it's necessary we address the parallelomania accusation. And you mentioned this before we even recorded earlier on the phone.
Okay, I think there is such a thing as parallelomania.
Mm-hmm.
I also think there's something called parallelophobia.
Mm-hmm.
Christians were parallelomaniacs.
Say that again. You broke out. The internet glitched you.
Loved parallels. This is
okay,
how they
that
were
again.
taught.
Sorry, you broke up. Say that again.
There's such a thing as parallelophobia. Mm-hmm. And the ancient rhetoricians loved mimesis. They taught it in schools as a way of crafting beautiful literature. I also think that some of my opponents have homerophobia. That is, they're allergic to Homer for some reason. I really don't understand entirely.
Do you think it's that, or do you think it's the lack of immersing them in Homer? Like, how much do they really know Homer and its importance overall in the ancient world? I don't know. What do you think?
So say that
Homeric, broke up really, really bad.
Homeric Greek is not easy. And it's a lot easier as a scholar to ignore it than to learn Homeric Greek and to get involved in this kind of discussion. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, I think you broke out, and I was speaking over you a little bit there. I didn't mean to. I thought you were pausing for a moment. Did you hear what I was saying about the maybe it was it's a lack of
yeah, no, I did. Yes, I did.
Okay. I was making sure because it seemed glitchy. All right, well, we'll just continue. But I again, that background knowledge that this parallelomaniacs, they were doing this in antiquity when they recrafted, rewrote, and emulated or imitated or invented new narratives. They were literally looking for parallels when they did these kinds of things. So it's a subjective science that we're in. It's an artistic subjective science. But like, once you know they're doing this, and then you see really strange scenes that even when I have someone like Del C. Allison Jr. on and I ask him about the demoniac, which we're going to get to, and I say memory or fiction, which he does not play with the Greek epics or Greek classics. It's purely scripture. He looked at it and goes, that story is so strange. That's not a memory. They made this story up. And I think to myself, well, that's really interesting. Where did they make this story up from? Where's the scripture at? Where's the Jewish antecedent? Why is the water into wine not found in Jewish antecedents? And you get Rudolf Bultmann going, it's part of Dionysian legend. Like, that is completely ignored by IP. He has found every excuse to dismiss my points.
Yeah, let me give you an example from Quintilian. Quintilian is a contemporary of Mark. He's writing in Latin for Latin students. He tells them that the beginning of their studies is mimesis. That's where they start. And what are the models that he uses? They come from the Greeks. They're Plato for philosophy. It's Homer for poetry. It's Demosthenes for rhetoric. Now, they also have parallels. They do Latin texts too, of course, Virgil and Cicero and so on. But mimesis is the core of literary education. So they are not committing parallelomania. They're doing mimesis.
They're doing it with scripture, and no one bats an eye when they're doing mimesis with scripture. I mean, maybe some do.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
MacDonald draws attention to the fact that Mark says Jesus renamed the sons of Zebedee to the sons of thunder. He says this was meant to imitate Castor and Polydeuces from the Iliad, and lists several parallels that are supposed to connect them. But MacDonald's main argument is Mark is trying to make Jesus resemble Odysseus at this point in the gospel. And Castor and Polydeuces were not companions of Odysseus. They were supposed to be already dead by the time of the Iliad and Odyssey. Margaret Mitchell says, they are hardly similar to the narrative function of the living James and John in Mark's work, who followed Jesus from their father's boat to adventures in Galilee and even beyond the pages of Mark's narrative canvas. We also should note Mark never explains why Jesus changed their names. If he was trying to make a connection to Homer, this would have been the perfect time to expand on this parallel. One cannot read too much into a brief reference, as MacDonald seems to have done. His list of connections is also not convincing. The first one is far too general. They are sons of someone, so what? If Mark was writing fiction, he could have at least made the name of the father similar. The next one is also not the same. Castor and Polydeuces.
I just don't understand how that's possible for him to make.
Your screen
where
here.
else in the New Testament, or even in classical literature, do you find two brothers who are given a common sobriquet, a name, as sons of a deity, or sons of thunder? The god, Zeus is the god of thunder. Now, these parallels should just jump out at you, but that's not what Mitchell is willing to concede.
Yeah, so part of it is, again, the entire drive that I know is at the basis of what IP is doing. He is clearly doing this to dismiss any literary imitation from non-Jewish sources. But even then, if we had a just Jewish source conversation where I was pressing him on imitation of Moses, Elijah, Elisha, David, Joseph, you name it, characters of the Old Testament, he would not take the fictive route. He would not say that they're literarily inventing narratives to craft him. He would say, no, Jesus did those things imitating the scripture or fulfilling it in some literal historical eyewitness sense. So what he's doing is he's hunting scholars who have come after your work or critiqued your work, cherry picking them out, using them as a weapon against you. And of course, that's why we had a conversation with Karl to have him clarify some of his points and his disagreements and his common ground with you as well. But in this particular one, just so people understand, he's talking about the sons of thunder that is mentioned for the two brothers and in Mark's gospel. And you're going to notice this theme throughout the entire video. You never get a parallel right, Dennis. You're just completely lost. You have no clue what you're talking about. This is what he's doing in this entire video with your work. You there?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So I have your notes here, and I wish I could play this video and have your notes up because you go through a lot of the objections and your critiques before we get to Polyphemus.
Oh, here's another complaint. He says, James and John are not like the Dioscuri, the Castor and Polydeuces, because Mark should have made the Boanerges Argonauts as opposed to fishermen. Come on, how are you going to make them Argonauts on the Sea of Galilee? You just have it really was laughable to go through this.
You said it's even a stretch to make them the disciples fishermen on the lake Mark called the Sea of Galilee. Like it's already a strange thing that we have them on this lake, which we didn't even get to the boat stuff yet, the mini ships. And I went there. I was on this lake. It's not that big. It's big for a lake. It's a big lake, but it's not that big. And we actually got to see a first century boat, what it looked like. It could probably barely fit 8 people in it, maybe 6. Talk about a ship. I mean, the language. So they're clearly lifting Mediterranean language into this little lake area for Mark's gospel, but we'll get to that. Should I just continue playing?
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
All right, and you have your notes up, but I wish I could just show people these objections because you went through and analyzed everything he's saying and brought back responses to all of it. So
Odysseus are called boys or lads. Sons has a different meaning. Argonauts were not fishermen. They were a band of heroes. James and Castor did not die the same way, and James' death is not even in Mark. If Mark was trying to imitate Castor, why did he leave out such an important detail? In Acts, James died by the sword, and so was most likely beheaded. Castor died by suffering a mortal wound from a spear because he was keeping watch in a tree while his brother was attempting to steal cattle. Mark also doesn't hint to the idea that John was thought to live to the second coming. In John's gospel, he debunked this later rumor that is not present in Mark. Polydeuces did in fact ask Zeus to split immortality with Castor, but this is not close to what is in Mark, since they asked to sit at Jesus' right side and share in his glory. And finally, the last one is not a parallel, it is the opposite. So when we go through these alleged connections, we encounter numerous differences, and trying to make parallels from aspects that are way too general to be of any significance is not sufficient.
Okay, let me comment on that.
Yeah.
The story of the Dioscuri is that one of the boys was a son of Zeus and therefore was immortal. The other was the son of a mortal and therefore was mortal. When Castor dies, Polydeuces, the divine son, asks Zeus that they can have they could alternate a single life so that in alternate ways, one is alive and the other is dead, and so on. And it was well known in antiquity. James and John come to Jesus and they want special treatment in the hereafter. They want to sit at Jesus's right and left hand. But Jesus denies their request for two reasons. One, it's not his to give. It's God's determination, which is similar to Zeus's agreement with the Dioscuri. The other is James and John need to earn that position by martyrdom. And so that's why you have the difference. It's a difference between, let's say, a paternal gift to Polydeuces and the requirement that martyrs are needed. You have to be a martyr if you expect to live to sit at Jesus's right and left hand. So here's an example, Derek, of differences between two stories that have a theological bent to them. James and John have to earn the seats on Jesus's right and left hand by martyrdom. So that's a syncresis. It's a good example of where James and John, or Jesus, is superior to Zeus in making this request, in his rejection.
Got it.
And the last one is not a parallel at all. Now, MacDonald deals with this issue by appealing to transvaluation, which is when one takes a text and transforms it into something new, or the strategic replacement of the values of the targeted text with new ones. So allegedly, Mark could take something Homer said and change it to the opposite, and somehow it is still a parallel in MacDonald's eyes. He says, Mark did not merely mimic the Dioscuri, he transvalued or emulated them. Jesus refused the request of the sons of thunder for eternal honors, insisting instead on the importance of suffering. The obvious problem with this is it makes MacDonald's claims unfalsifiable. If differences can also be parallels, there is no way MacDonald can be proven wrong. As Margaret Mitchell said, MacDonald's reading of Mark, while ingenious, is for several interrelated reasons ultimately unconvincing as a recreation of historical, authorial intent. First, the strong reading relies too much on a have your cake and eat it too methodology, since in his argument, parallels between the two narratives support direct influence, but divergences do also, since they demonstrate that Mark was not just imitating, but emulating and transforming Homer. This means in essence that MacDonald's thesis once propounded is theoretically incapable of invalidation. Second, many of MacDonald's interpretations of particular passages are forced or contorted, rendered on the basis of inconsistent application of interpretive principles.
This is worth
that is so problematic for mimesis, to say that differences are not themselves flags to imitation. The reason that these authors are imitating is, in fact, to transform them. It's not simply ornamental. It's hermeneutically freighted. And this is a good example. And Mitchell then says that my work is unfalsifiable because she's not willing to see that difference is in fact the point. So that and there are other, how do you explain the other parallels then? So I want to just give a little modest, really short lecture on how mimesis works in antiquity. You start with a typos, that is a model. So you've got a model in mind. Now you want your reader, in some cases, to. So you pile up similarities, prepared to make a comparison. But then you do a switcheroo, and you show that there's a difference between the two, and that's called a syncresis. By the way, the similarities are called homoiote, that is similarities. So you have a typos, a model, then you have similarities that alert the reader to compare the two, and then you have a syncresis, which is the switcheroo. Now, both the similarities and the switcheroo are flags to the model. And Mitchell is totally deaf to that part of ancient rhetoric.
So, and here's my takeaway, right? Even if someone wasn't persuaded by an episode that the full-blown hermeneutical freight is taking place, there's enough signals to think there's artistic emulation at bare minimum, that this is exactly what Karl's seeing, that there's some type of subtle artistic emulation happening throughout the Gospels. So again, if you even allow an inch, right, there's the opportunity for the mile, or you can still keep the inch. But the idea is, if I find differences, what that means, disregard all of the prior parallels that seem to be significant.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So you don't need to buy. I'm trying to say this for the public audience and for those who might be critical and don't accept your full-blown hypothesis here. You don't need to go all or nothing. You can go along the path and choose what looks to be the case, but to dismiss outright, I mean, just Sons of Thunder. What's going on? Just with the words there. I mean, why would you call two Jewish guys who are fishermen on a sea, who are supposedly so Jewish in their activities, Sons of Thunder? Is that not a signal to Zeus? I mean, who else doesn't know? I mean, unless you want to say it's Baal or the storm deity Yahweh, like an ancient idea that no, Sons of Thunder would have made a lot of sense, especially writing it in Greek, to signal Zeus. It seems to me that would be the immediate response someone would have in their mind. But correct me if I'm wrong here.
No, you're not wrong. But I really do want to push back against Karl Olav Sandness. He rightly sees the difference between Homeric ornamentation and Homeric mimesis. He also, and I agree on this, that a literary judgment is not the same as a historical judgment. So that you can say that you've got ornamentation, that doesn't mean that there's not a historical bedrock to it. And I make that point with the death of the crucifixion of Jesus, that Mark is imitating the death of Hector, but it doesn't mean Jesus wasn't crucified, as a mythicist would take it. Right. So I think there is a relationship between literary creativity and historical memory. And in some cases, you have stories that are simply manufactured. In other cases, you have embellishment of things that actually happened. And Sandness and I agree on that. What I would insist on from my perspective, and this is a different from Sandness, that this is very heavily hermeneutically freighted. This is why the story is told. Mm-hmm. It's told to engage in the culture to say that Jesus is superior, whether it's in strength or power or compassion or ability to heal or whatever. So I'm not going to give up on this issue of syncresis, because that's why the mimesis takes place in the first place.
I like to flip the coin for 1 second and reverse this onto IP, Michael Jones, and anyone who might be accusing you of unfalsifiability. I'm not saying that Margaret Mitchell has this, because I haven't read her works myself in depth. But I know that the apologists don't want these narratives in the New Testament to be fictional in any sense, whether or not you think they're imitating scripture from Jewish or not. they will bend over backwards to make it unfalsifiable that this is a fictional or a contradictory passage that cannot have happened in history. They die on the hill of making it all true. And what we'll get to in a moment, and I'd like to pull up a Christian article who actually sympathizes with your work and has learned the muse, so to speak. He points out parallels in Mark 4, which never advertises for Jonah, imitating Jonah. And there's so many differences, but there's similarities. And so lots of scholars have noticed, they have keen observation in Mark 4, where they're on the sea and its storm comes and all that. Between Jonah and Jesus, no imitation is explicitly mentioned that this is what's happening. But that would never bother these guys, because they would just go, yeah, because this actually happened. So we don't even need it to imitate scripture here. This literally happened, making it again an unfalsifiable claim by them. So like they want to claim you have an unfalsifiable position because you change things or find ways where the differences are happening, and you're saying this is synchrosis. This is what they're doing. It's intentional when they're remodeling the story. They go unfalsifiable. You start pinning them down on contradictions or pinning them down on fictional aspects, they will double down on it happening in history. They will not grant that this is just fanciful literary invention or any of that. So like they're just as guilty if they're trying to blame you, is my point. So,
okay.
We can see this in another place. MacDonald says the incident in Mark 5 of Jesus saving the demon-possessed man is an imitation of when Odysseus faced off with the Cyclops. Like before, MacDonald lists what he perceives to be several parallels and argues Mark intentionally reworked the story. But Kristen Larson evaluates...
I find this so funny, this entire section where like he does not have there's not a single one he grants you.
MacDonald's theory and demonstrated it is riddled with problems. MacDonald modified this list in later publications, but it's mostly the same, and since we are relying on Larson, we'll use this list as it's what he responds to in his paper. First, some of these alleged parallels are way too general. Jesus and his crew disembarked. What do you expect would happen if you got off a boat? In both, someone has asked for their name. Most people ask for names when they encounter someone new. At the end, the crew re-embarked and sailed away, which is how you would expect them to leave if they arrived on a boat. The second one is not a real parallel. Homer said that when Odysseus arrived at the island, and before they disembarked, therein lived wild goats innumerable, for the tread of men scares them not away. When Jesus arrived on the other side of the lake, which is not an island, Mark didn't say anything like this. He only notes there were 2,000 pigs later in the story to explain where the demons went. Notice this is not mentioned before they disembarked, and goats are not the same as pigs. If Mark
Can I stop there?
Absolutely.
Why do you think Mark is going to use pigs instead of goats?
Circe.
Because he's going to talk about Circe.
Right.
Where else in the New Testament do you find a comment about how many domestic animals are around? Where else do you get in the New Testament somebody asking for somebody's name? And in Homer and in Mark, the same word for name is there. What is your anima? What is your anima? And in both cases, you get a false answer. In one, it is nobody, and the other is the opposite. That is, it's legion. Well, is that a parallel or is it not? It's a syncresis. Come on. Use your imagination. Or here's another one that I really love.
Yeah.
I think later in the clip, we'll see this. You can't have a parallel about Jesus sailing and Odysseus sailing, because Odysseus landed on an island and Jesus landed on mainland. And my comment was to him, what island on the Sea of Galilee would you like Mark's Jesus to go to?
Right.
There are no islands on the Sea of Galilee, for pity's sakes. So he takes this small difference to disqualify the whole motif of sailing and arriving and coming across a monster and so on. I mean, it is so crazy.
I think you're right.
Trivial.
It is. The difference, any difference for him is enough for him to get all the people who are pearl clutching for their dogma, in my opinion, to prevent this from happening, what you're saying. And I just thought to myself, I'm like, okay, we can play this game of finding parallels. And in fact, the other video, which isn't even worthy of your response, because it's kind of a mockery of you, and they go to the Civil War and they're trying to act like, well, the Civil War is imitating Homer now. And like show me, this would be an interesting case, show me where early settlers of America wrote that we are to emulate Odyssey, emulate Homer, imitate it. We breathe it from birth to death. We are supposed to model it. And by the way, we're going to write in Greek. I mean, like, there's so much that it's just an absurd, ridiculous, silly video. So when you actually deal with this video, which I think is more important in critiquing, your point is just even more capitalized when I think, how many examples can you find in antiquity where there are soldiers, men that are fighters, soldiers, that are transformed into swine, into pigs? How many of those kind of pictures come to mind in the ancient world? Well, you get that in the Aeneid because it's modeled after Odyssey, duh. But then you find a legion, which would have represented Rome and its soldiers, possibly even the 10th Legion, which had a symbol of swine as its symbol.
That's
and
right.
These are the Roman legion soldiers going into swine. Sure, they're not literal soldiers. They didn't literally transform into pigs. But yeah, they go into pigs. And so if you can't see the clever creativity of this author, honestly, your point, philological fundamentalist or just fundamentalist outright. That's all I'm seeing.
Yeah.
I'll keep going.
Yeah.
He could easily have.
That's just a dishonest, obviously not realizing, like, of course you jump to Circe, but that's where they say the problem is. You can't leap from book 9 to book 10, or like you're not allowed to look at the next episode in the Odyssey, which has been around for 800 years. No, Dr. MacDonald, you can't do that.
Written goats to imitate Homer. MacDonald deals with this by suggesting that Mark 5 also parallels the Odyssey book 10, where Odysseus' crew is turned into pigs by Circe. Allegedly, when Odysseus' crew disguised themselves as sheep to escape the Cyclops, this foreshadowed them being turned into livestock. But the animals are not the same, and the foreshadowing is speculative. And also, this is a reoccurring problem. When the details don't match, MacDonald just asserts without evidence that Mark jumped to a different passage to imitate before jumping back to the main passage. You can make anything match if you cherry pick the details. Number 4.
Let me talk about that.
Yeah, please go ahead.
In ancient rhetoric, rhetoricians taught their students to use multiple models. And that is, they are cherry picking from the models in order to create their narrative. And this was the image that was used, that a good author is like a bee that goes from flower to flower collecting nectar in order to create sweet honey. And so authors were told how to, and this, scholars call it eclectic mimesis, that you have more than one model. Another reason for doing that is it protects you from charges of plagiarism, so that you're not just, imitating one document, you're doing several, and it shows your innovation. So this idea of cherry picking is really unfair. And also unfair, it's to say that I'm not conscious of similarities in sequence. One of my 7 criteria for my mimesis criticism is order. It's the importance of sequence of similarities. And Derek, I'm going to ask you at a later time to show the document I created for you to show how these motifs are clustered together in arrangements.
Yep.
So it's not arbitrary.
Absolutely. Again, it never ends with when you jump to a different spot or you're cherry picking. This is what he's saying. I was thinking of Dionysius of Halicarnassus, but also Cicero, who thought you needed at least 5 models or more. And then later he changed his mind. He goes, one model will work. But notice how they're playing with like grabbing from several models to emulate and imitate prior models of literature. And again, my question still stands. If you just found generally many swine soldiers transformed into swine by magical sorcery, okay? Because this accusation arises on Jesus. Is he a magician? Well, we get this hint that's threaded throughout the gospel. Oh, by Beelzebub, he's casting out demons. He has magical abilities like Circe does in this earlier canonical Greek text. So it's just like, when you see that, there's enough there to think, would they not be imitating in some way this earlier story? Some way. It's pretty obvious. If you wanted me to like disregard this or be convinced that, okay, this parallel doesn't work, then just grab other examples of soldiers being transformed into swine by someone with magical abilities. And guess what? I'll just say it's a general mythic trope, and therefore I can't prove or even lean into it must be Homeric. I could then go, it might be Homeric, but no, give me other models. Give me other examples of this story. If you don't have them, the question still stands.
Yeah, good.
All right, here we go.
Is not a good parallel. The only similarity is they are both monstrous in some way. But Larson says, the giant was savage and lawless from the viewpoint of Odysseus, not from the viewpoint of his own community of Cyclops. The demoniac, on the other hand, was an outcast and seen as savage and lawless by everybody. The giant lived in a cave, whereas the demoniac lived among the tombs, which are merely caves. The setting is thus not a very distinct element of the parallel, and the characteristics of the antagonists differ.
Dennis, I feel like we're going to be pausing a million times. Please comment on this.
Yeah, I'm sure that the Cyclops, Polyphemus, was recognized as a neighbor by the other Cyclopes, and all of them would have been considered awful in the rest of humankind. So that's a good example of their cherry picking. I just don't. When I first heard that, I just couldn't believe that they go to those lengths to note differences. And here's something I need to say now, because it's going to come up over and over again.
Right.
This video emphasizes that the differences between two texts where I'm identifying mimesis are more striking than the similarities. And I would agree, the differences are more obvious than similarities. You don't have to defend why you have different differences between two texts, because that's characteristic of two texts. Mm-hmm. What you have to determine is why you have so many similarities between two texts. That's the challenge. Now, you can have similarities between two texts because of generic mythologies. You can do it because of mimesis. You can do it because of accident. But you have to explain the similarities when they are dense, when they are sequential, and they are distinctive. And that's what these apologists are unwilling to do, because they're going to say, oh, there are more differences in these texts than there are similarities.
Right.
Well, I would say, let's go back and visit the differences and see if they're hermeneutically significant. Why would an author make those differences? And here's an example. All right, yes, you have pigs in one story and you have sheep and goats in another story. I can explain the differences because you have the Circe story that requires pigs and sheep. So it's that kind of shell game that these people play, that you don't have to explain differences, you have to explain similarities. And it's the similarities that are the ones where you're going to find synchrosis, that is critical comparison and engagement.
Thank you.
MacDonald is correct that tombs in Mark 5 were caves, but then why didn't Mark just say cave if he wanted his readers to know that he was imitating Homer? Why change it to tomb? Because of this, this cannot be a literary parallel. The fifth is hardly comparable.
Okay, I'm going to stop there.
I love this.
One says tombs, and the other says, one is the Odyssey says caves,
right,
and the other is cave tombs. So those are different, right?
Right.
Where else do you find in the New Testament or even in classical literature where people are living in caves of any kind? You know, so you can't dismiss the motif by saying that these are different kinds of caves. Please.
I also want to add something. This gets into the synchrosis of this. Why are they tombs, cave tombs? I think this is the important difference, because Jesus is going to overcome death. Theologically, the point is he is going to overcome death. This is all foreshadowing his death from the very outset of the gospel. You get this idea. He's going to die and overcome that tomb. And here he is facing a man who has the grips of death and Hades holding on to him, just like Heracles goes into Caucasus cave to go and defeat the monster, just like that's emulating right there with Polyphemus. And so if you do not see what's happening with that, then I don't know how I can help you, because that's the point. He is going to.
Well, that's a very good example of
sorry,
it's
go ahead,
a very
Dennis,
good explanation of a difference.
Yes.
That what you gave is a very good example of a difference. The reason that you have caves or a cave tomb has to do with the death motif in the Gospel of Mark.
All right, continuing.
The Cyclops asked if Odysseus came to harm him, but the demoniac recognized who Jesus was and pleaded with him not to torment him. The Cyclops doesn't know.
Hold on. That's important to just nail, because they are terrified he is going to harm them. The demoniac demons are terrified that harm's going to be done to them. They're begging Jesus not to do anything to them. Am I on? Are you there, Dennis? Dennis? Did we lose you? Hey. I hope I'm not glitched. Let me know in the chat if I'm glitched, guys. Everybody. Let me know in the chat. I'm waiting on Dennis. I think his internet's being funny. Dennis is frozen. I'm fine. Awesome. Okay. He'll be jumping back in probably any second if it kicks him, because it looks like it's a glitch. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So we're having fun. We're diving into this. I can't wait to show you guys some images, because there's some really important visuals to kind of capitalize on what the Homeric visuals that at the beginning of this live stream, Karl Olav Sandness said they would have understood these narratives as pictures as well. Dennis, you're live.
We have a terrible system here, and we don't know what the problem is. Yeah.
No worries. I don't know if you caught my last statement. I'll play it just so that you are aware. But the demons are like crying out, like almost begging Jesus not to harm them. Yeah. So he let me just back it up just a little here and play this.
The tomb. Because of this, this cannot be a literary parallel. The fifth is hardly comparable. The Cyclops asked if Odysseus came to harm him, but the demoniac recognized who Jesus was and pleaded with.
So, did you come to harm me? This big monster in a cave is saying, and then a guy who's like a monster at a tomb cave filled with demons, they're asking, you know, they're like implying, "Are you don't hurt us?" Like no, don't do anything to us. Don't harm us, is what it seems to be implying.
Well, in fact, in the Circe story, Circe says to Odysseus, "Do not harm you. Do not harm me."
We're going to get into that.
You will not harm me. So that's where Circe comes in handy.
Okay, continuing.
With him not to torment him. The Cyclops doesn't know who Odysseus is, which is not similar to Mark. The seventh parallel is not the same, and MacDonald would have to rescue this one by.
So notice how he literally just went right over. Odysseus answered nobody. The demoniac answered legion. He just like immediately just crossed that one out. Like, again, Dennis, this is what frustrates me and why I think there's dishonest intentions happening here. And there's not a real motivation for truth. And I guess Michael's been pissed off at me, made a video about me saying I'm a liar because he found two things I made a mistake on. Because honestly, I can't help but seeing this and going, you're really not taking this serious. This sounds dishonest in how they're critiquing you.
I agree with you. Yeah.
By claiming transvaluation. The only similarity is there is naming at play. Odysseus says to the Cyclops, his name is nobody. But the demons say to Jesus, their name is legion because they are many. One has to ignore the numerous amount of differences to make this a parallel.
I think that's so obvious opposite that it becomes apparent what seems to be implied here.
That's
I don't
right.
know.
That's right.
Also different, since both heroes achieve victory differently. The 9th and 10th are not the same. The Cyclops calls out to his neighbors for help, but gets none because of Odysseus' trickery. In Mark, the swineherders go to the city for help, and the people beg Jesus to leave. There is nothing narrated in Mark that says the people came to ask about the pigs. Larson says, the neighborly response is a part of the Gerasene story that has no parallel in the Cyclops story. Furthermore, due to the scarce amount of narrative information characterizing the storytelling of Mark, the response of the Gerasenes comes across as a non-trivial story element. The next one is an odd comparison. Nothing in the Odyssey depicts the Cyclops as naked. This comes from later paintings of the story.
Hold on, this is good. Okay.
Even if this was a valid parallel, Mark would not be imitating Homer's literary work, but a popular misconception. Furthermore, the demon-possessed man is clothed at the end, which is no parallel in Homer.
Okay. We must, Dennis, make your comment here, and then I'll go ahead and get prepared to show what I brought to kind of let people see some stuff here. But so does the Odyssey
caveman? And everybody that I know in antiquity would claim that he's nude. And so this is, and you're going to show us the art, at least of some of these images. And when in the popular imagination, Polyphemus is nude. Now, you don't have to say that in the text, because the antitext, the model, can only be read, or was read in antiquity, as a caveman is nude.
So, okay, I did some research real quick. What's up, Apologia? It's not fair to have two intellectually honest hyperbrains against one IP. Thanks for showing up, everybody. Go subscribe to Apologia and Kip Davis. I saw him in the chat here, and make sure you subscribe. We got a stream coming up with Kip. Misinterpretations is here. There's tons of people are here. Tons and tons. All right. So this image right here, right, where you see these guys jabbing this nude person on pottery, it just so happens to be mid-7th century BCE, roughly around the time this literary work was written. So if the misconception was, or the misinterpretation by the Greeks themselves of their own literature was that he was nude, it happened back then, which would then mean everyone interpreting it from then, 7th century, mid-7th century BCE onward, understood the caveman to be nude. This is what IP does. He'll do a comment, oh, Jesus turned water into wine, but Dionysus didn't do it till the 3rd century AD. Then when you go look at the sources and you talk to classicists like I have, and they go, what kind of minutia differences he's looking for? Like you need almost a verbatim quote of a Dionysian narrative that says, here's an empty jar. He told people to fill it with water at a wedding, and the water then transformed in 6 jars, by the way, into wine. He needs verbatim copy to be persuaded something's happening. What you would call philological fundamentalism. And I mean, it's clear, right? So 7th century, depicting the blinding of Cyclops. Here's another one that I got, the Cyclops on the right, where Odysseus and his men are jabbing him. That's the same jar. And get this, that's a funerary jar. I don't know if this has any theological implication in the Greco-Roman world, because many of the funerary sarcophagi, the vases, however you pronounce that, oftentimes funerary ones have the scene of the Cyclops and the scene of Circe. They're significant on a lot of these. So 660 BCE, here you have another Greek terracotta figurine, 5th century to 4th century BC, one-eyed Cyclops. He's definitely nude. Here's another one, and this is on a plate, 550 BCE. Here's another one where Odysseus is on the right, hardening his stick in a flame, and he's about to go and help blind the Cyclops. And this one was, I don't know if the date, I didn't have the date on there, but I know it's like 500 BCE somewhere. Here's another one. This is the art that Karl Olav Sandness was saying at the beginning, in agreement with Dennis. Like, people would have known these episodes through art and by each individual stories. They would have understood these things. Here's another one. This is where's this at? I feel like this is Pompeii by the art style.
Pompeii, yeah, that's Pompeii.
1st century BCE. Notice he's practically nude. He's got like a little, I don't know, some natural herb that the artist added here, but he's practically nude. Again, Here's another one. This is 1st century. So again, Polyphemus. Here's another one, 1st century. Polyphemus. This is literally at the time, roughly ballpark century or so, where the Gospels are being written. Here's another one, nude, 1st century AD fresco at Pompeii. And there's a letter from his lover. Here's another mosaic. And then this is a much later depiction of art. So again, yeah, they're still continuing what happened in the mid-7th century BCE. And then just jumping down to Circe, because we're going to get to Circe in a little more. Here's an image of a man, swine. This is 5th century BC. Like, it's all over the art. And if you just do a little cursory search on Google, you'll find out how prevalent this was in the Greco-Roman world, that it's all on mosaics. There's pottery, there's cups, there's sarcophagi. Here's another one right here. Dennis never saw this one, but this is a swine man, 5th century BCE. There's another one. Human swine. This is all based on Homer. So if you could find other stories where this is what's happening, where men, soldiers are transforming into pigs, help me out here. And then we have to ask, is it likely the Gospels are aware of this particular narrative in Greek literature, right? So here's another one, sarcophagus, and I love this image. This is 6th century BCE. That is Circe on the right, in the middle on the right. They're pig men on the outskirts of both, and the knife is up to her. That's Odysseus. There's another one, and this is 490 to 480 BC. Here's another one, 440. I mean, literally, I did this right before we did the stream. Here's a emulation version from Virgil's Aeneid, Dennis, where Circe's island is here. Aeneas is fleeing on the boat at the bottom right. You can see the pigs in their little pen, and then you can see the different animals, because when they first appeared to the island, there were different animals. Wolves were there, different kinds of animals. But the pigs that transformed from soldiers, right? There's a lot of cool stuff. So, and that was in 1530. So that's I needed to give just a cursory, quick little glance at some of the art, Dennis.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thank you. All right, here we go.
Number 13 is not a real parallel. First, it's out of order because Jesus has not re-embarked at this point, but also it is not the same. Odysseus wants the Cyclops to tell everyone that Odysseus blinded him, which is nothing like what we read in Mark. Jesus tells the man to go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had...
We got to stop there.
Yeah.
That's syncresis. Odysseus tells Polyphemus that I'm the one who blinded you. Jesus tells the demoniac, tell them what the Lord has done for you. Now, who would you like to invite to dinner, Odysseus or Jesus? It's a syncresis. It twists the so that you have the similarities there, but the author Mark is saying, look how much better and more compassionate Jesus is to the Polyphemus. Now,
right.
Come on, is that a difference? Yes. Is it a similarity? It's in a way it is. And that's the reason Mark is telling the story, that Odysseus blinds and Jesus heals. Come on, get over it, apologists. This is ancient Christian apologetics itself.
Right.
This is what Christians are doing to say that Jesus is cooler.
I love it, actually. That's a cool version of it. And for me, it's unfortunate because someone will look at this one example and go, I see the difference, and not be persuaded. Again, we'll be showing the chart that you sent me of the density and the sequence of the narratives. But when you factor in all of that, you should at least be walking away, in my view, with a Karl Sandness, at least a basic subtle, at bare minimum, there should be something subtle here. And if you're not walking away with a subtle, I don't think you're doing your homework. That's my honest opinion. You should at least be in the door of saying, okay, Mark's doing something clever here from playing along with this ancient story in some way. So I'll continue.
No, I'm not gonna let you off so easy.
Okay.
I don't think that's just embellishment. That syncresis is so strategic that story has to be a part of Mark's agenda. He's got to be taking it to a hermeneutical level, just to say that Jesus is superior to Odysseus. So I'm not going to give up on that one. I don't think it's ornamental. Okay,
I don't want you to, Dennis. Listen, okay. I'm going to tell you, I 100% think look, if we can at least get people to see the subtle, then I feel like
that's fair enough.
Yeah, all I'm trying to do is get people to see the subtle at the bare minimum and realize there's someone like you who goes, nah, this is engaging, purposeful, just like Bruce Loudon does on Luke 24 with the Cleopas stuff, as you echo as well. So what I want to do is, it's almost like, if we can't get you to swallow the whole pill, I have liquid children's Tylenol for you. Okay. How about that? If we can get you to take, you see what I'm trying to do. And so, yeah, that's pretty much my goal, is to get them to at least enter the door and then realize, really, how can you actually distinguish them? How could you literally falsify the idea or distinguish from the idea that it isn't purposely hermeneutically carrying freight? Because once you see it happening, you almost have to like know the brain of the author to pretend he's not engaging with the earlier model that he's actually using. And I understand that Karl wants that advertisement to be explicit and say, I'm making a better than Odysseus, better than Circe story. But I don't know if you need that. As you had a student, Christopher B. Zeichmann, who points out imitation of Odysseus with Josephus in his own biography. So like, he doesn't say, hi, I'm making myself better than Odysseus.
No, that's true. That would be ornamentation. Yeah, right.
Yeah. All right, here we go.
MacDonald seems to have misunderstood what Jesus said. Larson says, the cured man is instructed to tell his friends of God's mercy. This clearly does not entail proclaiming to the world what miracles Jesus has performed, whose safety, after all, depends on remaining anonymous. Contrary to the instructions of Jesus, the man goes off to the 10 Greek cities, not to his friends, and specifically relates what Jesus has done. So whereas Odysseus wants the antagonist to let his identity be known, the cured man reveals the identity of Jesus, contrary to the instructions. Number 14 is also incorrect. Mark does not say Jesus was aboard when the man asked if he could come with him. And this is obviously different than the Cyclops asking for Odysseus to return. Finally, refusing a request
let me comment on that. In the Odyssey, Odysseus is already embarked, and Mark and Homer use the same word for embarkation, same Greek word. Mm-hmm. What IP does is they say, well, the participle is a present participle, and it means as Jesus was boarding, not that he's already boarded. Now, I'm sorry. The reason that you have him as he's boarding is he's having a conversation with a mortal who wants to join Jesus on his boat. Polyphemus wants Odysseus to come back after he's on his boat so he can kill him. This is so the difference, but what a big difference this is, right, Derek? Odysseus climbing on the boat, and the same word is used for. It's so trivial.
Dennis, repeat what you said. The last few sentences you broke up.
Is this a big difference to deny a similar motif? Odysseus already is on the boat, and Jesus is climbing into the boat, and both authors are using the same verb to talk about it.
Yeah, it's again, when he finds similarities, he's still going to find differences in the best he can. And it's like, oh, okay, whatever you do to make sure that it doesn't have anything to do with the previous text. Got it.
Way too vague to be a parallel. So as you can see, we can go through MacDonald's alleged parallels.
Again, here we are. Every single one of them crossed out. There's nothing to it, Dennis. You're just making up stuff.
And encounter numerous problems. The order isn't exact, details are wrong or misrepresented, transvaluation has to be employed extensively to rescue alleged parallels. MacDonald has to draw from the Odyssey Book 10 to strengthen his case. Furthermore, Larson has an even more damning critique. He lists the extent of the story in Mark side by side with the story in the Odyssey. Mark's story is about 2,000 characters, whereas in the Odyssey, it's about 24,000 characters. This gives us a ratio of 1 to 12 in the number of characters, which means the average distance between parallels in the hypotext is 12 times greater than in the hypertext.
Okay,
When you have
that is such a red herring. Nobody, as a classical scholar, is going to say that comparisons between two texts relies on the length of the narrative. And almost all imitations of Greek mythology are shorter than what you're going to find in Homer. So it simply is a red herring. You wouldn't use that criterion ever in comparing two texts. Now, Virgil has his own version of the Polyphemus story, and it is about a fourth as long as the one that you have in Homer. Now, in that case, there's no doubt that there's a similarity between the two because it's about the same characters. That is Polyphemus. But it's a red herring to say that a mimesis has to be the same length or even nearly the same length as the model. It simply doesn't work that way.
I'll continue before I bring up the chart that parallels.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
But again, the distance, the other question I would have when I'm looking at this is thinking to myself, how often when others imitated these narratives, did they actually use some of that padded information that's in between these episodes? Because when you read the Odyssey, some of those things that really stick in your brain is like the danger that Odysseus is in when he's in the cave dealing with the Polyphemus. Like, it's usually not the little not significant events that happen between, but almost the like danger or the very hype parts of these narratives that probably get imitated in other versions of Greek myth. Am I wrong about that? Or would you say that that makes sense what I'm saying?
I'm not sure I understand entirely.
So if there's 20,000,
except to say that Homer has a different aesthetic, and he is a master at colorful images, and you don't need those in the imitation.
Right. That's what I was saying. Like, out of 24,000 words, right? Like, what episodes would people remember? Like, in the culture, in the air, would they remember the very not significant details, or is it the moments where he's actually in danger in the cave, almost being eaten by This is my point. So,
if that's what you mean, I agree entirely.
Yeah, I think that the climaxes, like the important whoa moments of the story, would be what they would probably be imitating instead of, was it a donkey or was it a cat or was it a bird or was it like, it's much more about those whoa moments, I imagine, that stuck to the mind and memory of people throughout the centuries. But again, we'll just continue and then I'll show the parallels that you sent me.
Yeah.
A high amount of text, anyone can go through and cherry pick out similarities to what we see in Mark and then ignore the rest. The differences are far more extensive than anything that could be contrived to be a parallel. Also, the existence of similarities does not mean this is evidence of conscious imitation in Mark. Scholars have remarked on flaws of the contextual and qualitative dimensions of MacDonald's argument, particularly on the often vague nature of the parallels and the failure to demonstrate authorial intent. After all, influence or literary dependence is not the same as conscious imitation communicated to a contemporary audience.
Hold on. Influence or literary dependence is not the same as conscious imitation. So is this guy like kind of slipping in the idea that, okay, maybe it could be something going on here, but he's just not thinking that the author would have consciously imitated? I don't understand what.
Yeah, I think that's what he's saying. And this is, again, where syncresis comes in. He thinks that there is not an authorial intention. Well, surely there's an authorial intention if you're comparing Odysseus who blinds and Jesus who cures. That's your intention. It's in the syncresis. And they are so tone deaf to ancient syncresis and cultural engagement that it I don't know. I don't know the cure, honestly.
I know I said the cure in the description is open mind, but here's the interesting part in my observation of what you just said, and let's continue, is they have such an agenda for historicity of these texts that they don't realize what you're doing is a form of apologetics by imitating these ancient texts. Like if they forsook their dogma for 1 second and thought about what you're doing, that Jesus is the fulfillment of scripture and is better than every Greek god and every Greek hero on planet Earth, like that should be like, hey, we like what you're saying, Dennis, but because they're so threatened about their historicity dogma, that they know that this creates distance from what actually happened in history, they'd rather dismiss the beauty of making Jesus more beautiful as a theological freighted thing, and they'd forsake that in comparison to Greek myth and accept, oh, I have to have this eyewitness, this happened. Like, if they just let go for a moment and realize what's going on here.
You put that brilliantly. That is a beautiful articulation that that I think they can. I think pious Christians can benefit from mimesis. This is not an atheist project. It's a humanist project, and part of being human is to see comparisons between your heroes. And I just think they're turning their backs on something that should be welcome.
Yeah.
As noted, the Odyssey doesn't end with the death of the hero, so MacDonald has to claim that Mark shifted to imitate Hector from the Iliad.
Okay, we're shifting topics, so let me show people your parallels real quick before we move to Hector. All right. Let me know if everybody can see that pretty well.
Okay, what I'd like to do is to read the motifs in the left column, mark sequence, and for you and the viewers to note the Homer sequence, the numbers. Okay. Sailing in a flotilla is 1. 2, arriving at a dangerous location. Disembarkation. Those are all in the same order.
Got it.
A dangerous cave dweller. 5, request that one swear not to do harm. And that's from the Circe story. That's why the number is different.
And 6, real quick, just so people understand the sequence, are these the chapters or the books particularly?
No, the sequence is just in what order those motifs appear.
Got it. Okay.
And the numbers that are in bold are the ones from the Circe story. And you can see why the sequence is interrupted occasionally.
Got it.
So 6 is request for a name. And then the false sobriquet, which is the what is your name?
Nicknames.
Then herds of domestic animals, which appears in a different sequence.
Dennis? Did we lose Dennis again? Herds of domestic animals, ladies and gentlemen. So we see that that's 4, which it would have been up here. What the apologists want is 1 through 17 in literal numerical order, and don't have differences either. You have differences, they're not going to accept them. That'll screw up the whole thing. All right, Dennis. His internet is glitching out. We'll wait on him. We'll continue. I want him to read them off because he put a lot of work into critiquing and showing like all the flaws that the apologists are doing with all of this. Time stamped it and everything. I told him, hey man, if you would, because I don't have the time.
I'm back on now.
Oh, there he is. Okay. Dennis, we were at herds of domestic animals.
Okay. Then 9, characters becoming swine. 10, mass drowning. Those are from the Circe story. Herders' accounts of disaster to others. 12, response to accounts of disaster. 13, embarkation, into a boat. 14, a request for rejoining. 15, a refusal of the request to rejoin. 16, command to proclaim the encounter. 17, sailing off for a new adventure. And 16 is where you get the syncresis. Odysseus says, tell everybody that I'm the one who blinded you. And Jesus says, go tell what the Lord has done for you. Now, the parallels between the two stories thus are dense, sequential, and often distinctive. So here's my challenge to IP. if you can't deny all of those parallels and their density and their sequence and be intellectually honest. How do you explain those similarities? Yes, there are differences, but you don't have to explain the differences. And in some cases, we can. Pigs are not the same as sheep and goats. I agree with that. But nonetheless, the motif is there, and it's in the same sequence as you find in Homer. So give me a break.
He finds parallels between...
Derek, I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Are we, do we want to take some of the chats? We've covered a lot of the material.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have some people that have better questions than we can give each other.
We can. I didn't know if you wanted to get through Hector at least. I mean, I know this is a long video and stuff, but we have 5 super chats I could ask. You want to get to the super chats real quick?
Yeah, let's pick them up, and if we have time, we'll do the Homer, Hector one.
S. Mill, thank you for the super chat. Can you spell Homeric Centones?
Well, you've got Homeric right, but centones is Centones.
All right, I just
Cent O. I think it's OES. Yeah.
ONES.
Well, centone. Actually, the best way to do it is Homeric centos. Centos. Do it in English. Homeric centos. Centones. Oh.
Thank you. Thank you. The Smart Fool, thank you for the super chat. IP should do a response to Dennis's views of Andrew, because if you do, you'll take Dennis' views more seriously, even if you don't completely agree.
That's a very good comment, because the theological commitments are not there, and one can see how the procedure works without having it blurred with the commitments from theology.
That is a very important point. The problem is he knows that we see it in the New Testament. So is he going to be honest with this non-canonical material, knowing that we're looking at it going, what are they up to, right? What are Christian writers doing when they're publishing books? Anyway, but I'd love to see him actually come away recognizing, by the way, there are many scholars who've noticed your work on that and agree with you. So yeah. Thank you, The Smart Fool. Good to see you here. Albert Bernard Contreras, thank you for the super sticker. Wade Rogers, thank you for the super chat. Dennis, love your work. IP probably doesn't know that gospel authors worked from libraries where they had access to works of Homer and others and could directly and consciously reference these prior myths.
Yeah, we don't. Libraries in antiquity were really quite rare, and they weren't the same as we think of them, Wade. But and by the way, we also know that not all teachers of rhetoric owned all 48 books of the Homeric epics, let alone the other texts. So most collections of the Homeric epics were spotty, probably. Alexandria had a wonderful library, of course. Pergamum did, Rome did, but a full collection of the Homeric epics was rare. But we do know that there were certain books that were popular and that people loved to own, and rhetoricians used. The first 2 books of the Iliad were the most popular. Then you had the death of Hector in book 24, and in books 22 and 24 of the Iliad. Some of the adventure stories that we have in the Odyssey were popular. We also know that people wanted to share those books because they didn't have books around. So I think the the best way that people knew the Homeric epics probably was through art and through the rhapsodes and other people who were what called the singers. The texts of Homer were precious and they were exhaustive. We're talking about 24 scrolls, not book, not the codices of scrolls for each of the two epics. And then you add to that Euripides and Plato and so on. It was quite an undertaking to have a full library. So we have more spotty libraries, but they're selective. That doesn't mean that people didn't know Homer. They knew Homer through many different social vehicles.
It reminded me of listening to a scholar on the Aeneid recently. I was listening to who pointed out that Aeneid at least tried to match half with 12 books instead of 24, which is, that's why a lot of the scholars think, even though it wasn't complete, they do think that it was going to end at 12 either way, because he's at least doing half of what Odyssey did, which is really cool. Yeah, thank you. And then Chris McCarthy says, may Dennis's scholarship be known far and wide.
Chris, and just 2 days ago, I learned that an Arabic translation of one of my books, an Arabic translation, has been approved for publication. So I also am doing another book called Feuding Gospel Authors, and it should be available soon. And this one is going to be available also in Kindle. So thank you, Chris, for that. But we are working to make this scholarship more widely available, including an electronic version. And there's been some talk about this new book, Feuding Gospel Authors, being as an audiobook as well. So I'm getting some encouragement to do just what you say.
Thank you, Chris. The Smart Fool is back with a good one. Thank you for that super chat. Given Mark's background and context, why does Dennis think Mark mostly targeted Homer and the Iliad for Mimesis than the Aeneid?
That's a very good question. And the answer, I think, is really quite simple. The Aeneid, Homer was constituent of Greek identity in a way that the Aeneid was not, except for Romans. Furthermore, the gospel authors are writing after the Roman war, and they're hardly friendly to Romans for that, especially Mark. You can see it clearly. So Mark and Luke are actually rivaling the Aeneid, but they're not rivaling it directly. They're doing Homeric of the same text that Virgil used, so that our interpretation of Homer is better than yours, Virgil. Thank you very much. So they're aware of the Aeneid, they're aware of Virgil's imitations of Homer, but they want to do it better. And let me back up a little bit and say that Jews and other groups that were minority religions in the Roman Empire tried to craft out for their readers their social identity by engaging with Homer. And of course, they're doing that before Virgil even wrote the Aeneid. We can see this in the Jewish Apocrypha, and then we can see it alongside, about the same time as the Aeneid, with the Testament of Abraham. So the easy answer to this is Homer's in Greek. These authors are writing in Greek, and they don't have to fuss with the Aeneid, even though they're aware of the Aeneid in many cases.
I'd like to mention something cool. I don't know if the Smart Fool has actually read Chris Rosser's book, or not book, PDF. He has a really, really good paper here. This paper, and just to give you an idea, explores intertextuality in Mark 5, where encounter between Jesus and the Gerasene demoniac ends with the madman saved from monstrous oppression. Specifically, the loan word for legion, Latin legeo, signals an emulation of Virgil's Aeneid, Book 8, which relates the story of Hercules overcoming the monster Cacus to bring relief and rescue to the people. Hearing Hercules in Mark 5 confirms the trajectory of the gospel as it unfolds in Mark's telling. And he completely he goes, I know I'm going against the master of Mimesis here for a minute, but he is in complementary to what you're saying, Dennis. And so one of the aspects he sees is in the demoniac scene, you have chains. And in the Odyssey, the Polyphemus doesn't have chains in that narrative, but in the Cacus story, there's chains. So if you take what this question is and what your answer was, is they're competing with the Aeneid. Maybe they see the Aeneid, but they say, I'm going back to the anti-text, and we're going to have a better rivaled model of our Christian eternal kingdom over against the Roman imperial one.
That's entirely possible. That's possible for sure.
So I recommend this. I'll put this link in the chat for viewers who are wanting to read this themselves. I mentioned this on my live stream last night. It's a URL. You can click it. It'll open right up in your stuff. This is really cool. And it also is an interesting thing that in early Christian catacomb art, you had Hercules convert to becoming a follower of Christ in the catacomb art next to Jesus. So there's this rivalry even in the art where you find they're converting Dionysus, they're converting Heracles, like, oh, madman, to Dionysus, trying to sober him up and make him a convert of Jesus. Like, come on, right? Like, there's so much. Thank you, Smart Fool. Appreciate your super chat. All right, going back to, apologies, going back to the video. Do we want to get through this all today, Dennis? Do you have time?
I don't know that we need to do them all.
Let's just briefly mention Hector, because I know that his video goes into it. His video, ladies and gentlemen, is in the description. Go watch it for yourself. Watch the whole thing. It's worth listening to what Michael Jones is saying here, but also consider reading what Dennis MacDonald's saying. Listen to what scholars on both sides are having to talk about this. So Hector models.
Yeah, let's do Hector.
Okay. Should I play it, or do you want to just talk about it?
I think you could play it.
Okay, cool. I'm going to play it, and then we'll stop after Hector. How about that?
Yeah.
Just for time's sake.
But again, he has to rely on transvaluation and shifts the order at times to make it work. But the bigger issue here is MacDonald cherry picks out similarities and ignores the differences to make his case. One cannot obtain a full picture without evaluation of both. As David Litwis said, to focus on pure similarity is parallelomania. To focus on difference is apologetics.
Well, that's what Michael Jones is doing. He only focuses on the differences. I mean, he told on himself, but also what I find interesting, again, the very book he pulls this from, I don't know how much he agrees with. He might agree with that one comment, maybe, because he used it in his video. Go read Jesus Deus, ladies and gentlemen, how Jesus is depicted as a Mediterranean god. Okay, he does a cultural argument, if you will, rather than a literary one like Dennis. And it's really funny that Michael pulls this book out to make this quote, because if you read it, every single thing that Litwa says in there, Michael would disagree with practically, I would say. Maybe that's exaggerated, but I would say overall, he would disregard everything Litwa has to say on any of this, but he's only using Litwa because Litwa actually is criticizing your Mimesis criticism on a literary level.
Okay, let me say one more thing about Litwa. In a different book, he argues against me that no amount of similarities between two texts can qualify as mimesis. Now, give me a break. What other criteria can we use? So he denies the possibility of any direct mimesis, because for him, similarities between Christian mythology and classical mythology is all at the generic level, not the genetic level. So
and if it is at the genetic, he's saying you can't prove it. You could never substantiate or even.
That's right. That's right. No, you're right.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate because your critique of him in your synopsis of epic, the synoptics epic tragedy in the Gospels, I believe it's, you point out, well, then what do we do with Jewish scripture? Like when we see it
That's right.
clearly paralleling Jewish scripture, we have to just pretend that's generic, or are they not modeling it after the scripture? Now, that might be a different answer coming from his lips. I'm not 100% sure, but I know that he's in the vein of Jonathan Z. Smith, and he follows along more of the cultural paths rather than a genetic parallel.
That's right.
Yeah, and it makes me think of Jonah in Mark 4. It does not signal, it does not say Jonah here. It does not like advertise it publicly in this context. And there are many differences and similarities, but scholars have noted it looks like they're lifting from Jonah. All right.
Yeah.
Trying to find this here. Oh, where did I put it? Oh, here he is.
Stephen Boyce went through the two accounts and listed the similarities and differences. He notes there are some similarities, which MacDonald highlights, but when we factor in the differences, we can see the two accounts are drastically different. In both accounts, authorities pass judgment that the hero should die. But in the Iliad, Zeus hesitates because of the countless sacrifices Hector has made, whereas Pilate finds no fault with Jesus. Pilate tried to offer a substitute, whereas Zeus did not. And of course, Pilate was just a prefect. Zeus was a god.
Oh. What's interesting too, I don't know if this happens in Mark. Some scholars have noted that it looks like Barabbas is almost like the sacrifice, the lamb. What is it? The Passover lamb. Like there's Jesus is kind of symbolic here as this like Passover sacrifice, and he's being in opposition to this guy who's a murderer, right, in the story. But it sounds like, again, here's this there's a sacrifice. I'm not so sure if that parallels this particular Iliad or if you've noted that, but I know that some scholars have noted that.
Well, the simple response I'd have to that is Barabbas means son of the Father,
Right.
and Jesus is the Son of God. And who do the crowds want? They want the murderer, the insurrectionist, and they don't want Jesus. And so you certainly have a contrast between those two characters.
Sacrifices Hector has made, whereas Pilate finds no fault with Jesus. Pilate tried to offer a substitute, whereas Zeus did not. And of course, Pilate was just a prefect. Zeus was a god. MacDonald notes both Hector and Jesus were given mixed wine. But what the wines were mixed with is different. Hector was offered honey wine, and Jesus was offered...
What do you think about that, Dennis?
Oh, yeah, we can't have a parallel because one form of mixed wine is with honey and the other is with myrrh. So, you can't have a parallel because Jesus and Hector are all for different kinds of wine.
Right. Clearly.
Get over it, my friend.
sour wine. This also occurs for Hector at a much earlier place in the Iliad, and he was offered the wine because he was wearied by toil and not about to die. Also, the primary reason he was offered the wine was so he could...
One person's going to suffer and finally will die, and the other's going to die. Oh, so that can't be parallel.
give the first portion to Zeus as an offering. Hector refused, but Jesus accepted. Taunts are hurled at both, but Hector insulted Achilles first, which finds no parallel in Mark. Hector also did this during his battle with Achilles, which is unlike Jesus' trial and execution. The context in which the taunting takes place is completely different than what we find in Mark. This is cherry-picking out one similarity and ignoring a plethora of differences. Hector calling out to his brother is only vaguely similar to bystanders presuming Jesus called out to Elijah. If Mark was imitating Homer, he would have had Jesus call out to Elijah, or perhaps his own brother James. Hector was asking for backup, which is not a parallel to anything in Mark. Both do die with a loud cry, but the spirit of Hector goes to Hades, which is not said of Jesus, who only breathed his last breath. Hector also tried to reason with his killers, and Jesus did not speak to them. Jesus was also given a proper burial by a wealthy follower, and Achilles refused at first to allow one for Hector. MacDonald says both use the phrase from top to bottom, but the Iliad is referring to Troy burning, and Mark is talking about the temple curtain. This is simply cherry-picking one similarity out of a plethora of differences. The Greek phrase in Homer is in classical Greek, not Koine Greek, and Mark doesn't appear to be trying to imitate it. There's nothing else in this alleged parallel to form any kind of connection, since Mark doesn't narrate the later fall of Jerusalem. MacDonald interprets the centurion's statement not as an acknowledgement that Jesus was divine, but as if he was gloating or mocking Jesus. This is an odd interpretation that is speculative, which most scholars reject. It doesn't fit with the context of the centurion witnessing the effects of Jesus' death, like the temple curtain tearing or the darkness. Sandness points out the Empress Eudocia.
It is true that most scholars take the centurion's word as a confession of faith.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason in the text to make that claim. the IP person is saying that Pilate made that confession of faith because he saw darkness at noon.
Oh, you
But
mean
in
the
Mark,
centurion, right?
In Mark, I'm sorry?
You mean the centurion or you mean Pilate?
No, you're right, the centurion.
Right.
The centurion saw darkness at night and said, well, this must be God's displeasure with us. Jesus makes it clear, no, the darkness is his interpretation that God was not pleased with Jesus. My God, why have you forsaken me? Because that's a portent. Now, here's the other thing. He said that the centurion believes in Jesus as the Son of God because he saw the temple veil rend. Now, can you tell me how he would have seen the veil of the temple inside the sanctuary rent? No, that in fact is a judgment on the Romans for executing Jesus, and now the Jewish God is not going to pretend he's left the temple, and now he's not going to defend it any longer. So the better way to translate the poor, this mortal, a son of a god.
So
Let me say
repeat that
again.
sentence. You broke up.
It's a gloat. This is what Achilles says of Hector after he's killed him. Oh, we've killed the person that the Trojans used to worship as a god. Yada, yada, yada. He's dead. This is what the centurion does. Oh, right. This guy was a son of a god. No, he's not. He's dead. I took care of that.
Even if you granted, but wouldn't this still work? Even if, let's just say, someone didn't go with the taunt, it could still be a syncresis. If you did take your point of like it's a reversal where there's an admonition, but in the broader context of what we're looking at, if you grant that, you also have the hero who, when they die, the city is going to be destroyed. I mean, the literal reason that the city is being destroyed is because they killed the Christ. That God is going to cause this judgment to come upon Jerusalem, just as when Hector dies, the hero of the city of Troy, Troy gets destroyed.
That's exactly right.
I mean, you have to you have to factor that in. And so whether you wanted to go with the gloat or not the gloat, you could still go, okay, yeah, there might be a difference here, or there might be a gloating happening based on your interpretation here. And if it is a gloat, then it echoes exactly what Achilles is doing to Hector, which is interesting.
In her poem, was writing about the crucifixion and imitating Homer, and she didn't interpret this as a gloat, when it would have been easy for her to make such a connection. After all, she was drawing from Homer and the Gospels, and didn't see this as a gloat, which makes MacDonald's interpretation even more unlikely. MacDonald is correct, women are present when both heroes die, but for Mark, he has to say the women presumably lamented. This does not work because MacDonald wants to argue that Mark is consciously imitating Homer. From the text of Mark, we see no statements about the women lamenting. So how can he argue Mark is imitating Homer?
You can stop there again. I hate to stop you so often.
No, I'm glad you are.
Oh, the women who are watching from a distance, who are later going to come and try to anoint Jesus's body at the tomb, we're not lamenting.
The death.
Does we often have to say that? And furthermore, in Christian Apocrypha, these women are given lamentations. And where do the lamentations come from? They're the lamentations in the Iliad of Hecuba, Helen, and Andromache. So don't tell me that you can't have this theme of this similar motif of three women watching from afar because, well, the three women in the Iliad were weeping, but we don't know that the weeping women were weeping in Mark. Of course they were weeping. You know, that's...
What were they doing? Celebrating? I mean, yay, crucify my Lord and Savior.
It's just that nitpicking is really pathetic.
if we can only presume the women lamented. Sandness says, it is unwarranted, though, that this scene is the source of the Markan story, and that the similarities pointed out by MacDonald are his inventions. Boyce lists even more differences in a document linked below. Like with Mark 5, when we go through the differences, they pile up and outweigh the similarities. If Mark was imitating Homer, we should expect to see more explicit connections or direct quotes. Instead, one can only cherry pick out vague generalities, ignore the differences, and appeal to transvaluation when the parallels don't exist. As David Litwas said when speaking of another alleged parallel MacDonald tries to make. MacDonald creatively rearranges and tweaks most of his parallels in order to fit the structure of his often extensive lists and charts. One example is Jesus walking on water. MacDonald compares this passage with Homer's Iliad 24, 340-46, and Odyssey 5, 43-55. But in these Homeric passages, Hermes and Athena never actually walk on water. They fly over it. We can find similar problems when MacDonald tries to find imitation in the book.
Okay, let's stop there.
Yeah.
Can you show, Derek,
Yep.
the list of motifs and the sequence for the Homer stuff from what I sent you?
Yes, I can. Not that. That's Hector. So here is. This is the.
Okay, there we go.
That's Hector. The walking on water's next, of course. But
No,
did you
yeah,
want first?
no,
Hector first?
right there. That's
Yeah.
what you want. So you've got, this is what we're doing. So on the left-hand column are the motifs in Mark, and in the right-hand column, the motifs in Homer. You will notice that in this case, the numbers are exactly the same. 1 to 9, 1 to 9. So bravery, the first motif is bravery despite the consequences. Both are going to their death even though they may die. There's a refusal of wine. Third, there's a taunting between the Jesus is taunted as Hector and Achilles taunted each other. There's 4, a failed call for help, either to Deiphobus or the crowds I mistakenly think Elijah's being called. There's a recognition of divine abandonment. My God, why have you forsaken me? Hector knows that Apollo has now forsaken him when Deiphobus doesn't show up. 6, a dying threat of divine punishment. A dying threat. 7, a gloating over the killing. That's Achilles and the centurion. 3 women watch the death from afar, and there's a rescue of a corpse and a burial. Now, you can get rid of some of those motifs if you want to, but if they are there, they're in the same order. Mm-hmm. Now, people, Litwa and others, and this is true for what Sandness said too, that I manipulate the sequence. How can I be manipulating the sequence when these motifs appear in exactly the same sequence? I'm not moving them around, but still, the likes of IP are not going to grant any of the parallels. Mm-hmm. I just think that's intellectually irresponsible.
I also like this last one, rescue of a corpse and burial. Just for those who haven't heard Dennis's point on this, notice usually family members bury the loved one who are dying or being killed, and they're the ones who bury him. So then this character who's got the same name, Joseph, as what we later find out Jesus in Matthew particularly, because we don't find out that Joseph is the father in Mark, do we?
No, we don't have. No, Joseph is not the father in Mark.
Right. So there's this character named Joseph of Arimathea, who is best disciple town name, goes and buries Jesus. But before he gets to burying him, there's a serious danger of his life approaching Pontius Pilate to request the body in order to bury Jesus. It's almost like he needed divine intervention in order to be able to get Pontius Pilate to allow him to take the body. When you go back and you realize the father of Hector is having to have divine intervention, where this is where I believe the scene where Hermes is crossing the water, correct? If I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So Hermes is literally crossing the water, but he comes over and he puts all the soldiers in the camp of the Greeks asleep and allows his father to go through these gates all the way to Achilles and request his son's body, begging him, humbled and begging him, pleading for his body to have a proper burial, and finally relinquishes the body and was able to get out without anyone knowing, or else he would have been killed. So it's just a really interesting overlap. The other aspect, he's being dragged around for 3 days behind the chariot, and his body is not destroyed, like he stayed intact the entire time. It's just, there's really, really interesting things to go, is there something to this? Is there something?
In fact, a medieval version of the Gospel of Nicodemus, sometimes called the Acts of Pilate, sees the similarities between what Joseph of Arimathea did and what Priam did, and has its own imitation of the Iliad that is really quite remarkable in order to fill in the gaps. But what you didn't say quite is that in Mark, and only in Mark, does it say that Joseph dared to go to Pilate. And the word for daring is the same, it's a cognate to the word that Homer uses for the dangers that Priam is going to face when he goes to Achilles to get his son's body. So the parallels there, at least in the Middle Ages, was understood to be what Joseph of Arimathea did is what Priam did.
Got it. Awesome. Okay. Did we want to cover the?
No, I think I'm going to have to to say goodbye fairly soon. So tell me where we go from here.
Yeah, I mean, look, we could have gone into a few more examples. I think the big ones that he did was the demoniac mainly. That was the big one for me. Hector's another big one too, but it doesn't dwell as much time on that. He quoted Litwa, Karl, which obviously comes much closer than the way he's being perceived by this hit piece on you. He's much closer to you than they perceive it, even though you don't agree with conclusions. The other thing that I wish would have been brought up was the Euryclea example. I mean, that one is so distinct and interesting, and the pun on the name. But the other thing is I've got a video coming where I'm showing Bruce Loudon's doing this with Luke 24. And he says that Odyssey is in dialogue with Luke. This author of Luke is dialoguing with the Athena Telemachus narrative here with this theoxany hospitality myth of the road to Emmaus. And this isn't coming just from you. So I guess he's going to have to recraft another hit piece and take down Bruce Loudon, Robin Faith Walsh, because she sees it in Virgil, right? So she likes to lean into Virgil a little more than you do. So he's going to have to start having some hit pieces coming. And I hope Christopher B. Zeichman is going to join me here soon. I'm hoping to get Michael Kokonosh. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. How do you pronounce his name?
Kokonosh, yeah.
Kokonosh. Michael Kokonosh to come in and bring more of his mimetic comparisons. Richard Miller. I mean, these apologists have some work that they're gonna have fun making some more documentaries and hit pieces on us. Dennis, is there anything you'd like to comment on? I mean,
first of all, I want to thank you for giving for highlighting some of these problems. I want to be humble in a way. That is, Mimesis criticism is both subjective and objective. And I can understand why people like Karl Sandness will have a subjective assessment of mimesis that's different from mine. It also, though, is a science, and there are criteria that one can use for determining the likelihood that similarities between two texts issue from some kind of cultural engagement. It could be through the mythologies generally, it could be from particular texts. But the issues of similarities between two texts, in our case of the Gospels and classical mythology, cannot be ignored. You can't simply dismiss them because Hector is offered one kind of wine. Thank you very much. That kind of muster with any classicist that I know. So there's legitimate subjectivity, so mimesis criticism is objective to an extent, but it also is subjective, and it requires a sense of art and creativity in order to dissect it and to work with it. My big suggestion to those who are interested in following this up is to get a book copy or an audio version of the Iliad and the Odyssey and listen to it for yourself. By the way, Emily Wilson has new translations of both of them, and the introduction to her books on the Iliad and the Odyssey are just magnificent. And then that would give you an opportunity to see for yourself as you read the similarities between stories in the Bible, Hebrew Bible and New Testament, and these classical mythologies. And it's just make it an intellectual game for yourself. Have fun with it, and be creative. That's what's going on in the gospel composition. These are creative authors who are trying to craft social identities by using art and models in cultural engagement to portray Jesus in a way that is going to be satisfactory to their readers.
If I may, one comment on this, that just yesterday, diving into Loudon's work, which echoes and literally just bolsters your point about dialogue between the Odyssey and these Gospels. And he goes into the episode of the beheading of John, and he highlights how he thinks that the Mark and Matthew, but mainly Mark, I can't remember if he said Matthew, knew the Ovid metamorphosis phaeton myth of the Son, where here's the Father giving any granted wish you want, you can have, and getting himself into trouble through this granted wish of doing something he shouldn't have done. And he goes through and shows, first things first, the problems historically with the idea that Herod's daughter is dancing before him in an incestual fashion in front of guests, which just demonizes Herod even more. But then he goes a step beyond, even show when you go to Josephus, what actually happens to John the Baptist is nothing like what we're seeing here in Mark, and the reasons are completely different. So again, to Karl's point originally in our interview, there may be a memory, like you said, or some behind the scene thing that occurs in history, but they are clearly not trying to write a historical account of what took place. It is an artistic rendition using models and tropes and interesting, what you would say, mimesis and competition, emulation to earlier examples to make their social identity stand out. But they're doing it at the sacrifice of historical, literal evaluation, and rather in a poetic, artistic way. And we see the same problem with Pontius Pilate later, because he echoes this and he's like, Pilate is depicted in a completely non-historical way in the Gospel of Mark. He is absolutely a crude individual and would never be, sitting here having these fun, nice conversations with a guy who just got done cleansing the Jewish temple as a potential violent person, even though he says he's not violent in the garden and such. You see what I'm trying to get at? Like the depiction of him is non-historical, just like the depiction of Herod here is just demonizing Herod in a fictitious fashion. And the death of John the Baptist is obviously non-historical. So I guess what I'm getting at, if we get away from thinking these must be historical accounts of what actually occurred, and they're interesting, clever ways of writing maybe a memory, but into a fiction, like I think that's a better approach.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm just throwing stuff out there to make the point that the scholars are saying it clearly is not, this didn't happen in history. John the Baptist didn't die this way. Herod didn't do the things.
John the Baptist. Yeah, that's from the death of Agamemnon. When Odysseus goes to the netherworld, Agamemnon talks about how he was killed by his wife at a meal in his honor. And he was killed as one kills an ox in the stall. Well, you kill an ox with a hatchet, with an axe. And John the Baptist is killed at a feast with military officers there. And his head is brought into the feast on a platter. And in classical art, Clytemnestra is carrying an axe, which she used to chop off the head of her husband. That's the so you can have multiple models for these stories, and this is a part of the fun of it.
Wow, there's the bee imagery. We have one more super chat. Christy, do you see any mimesis with Virgil and 2 Samuel?
Boy, I haven't thought about it. I'd be happy to learn more about that. No, I don't yet.
Thank you so much, Christy, for the super chat. Look, ladies and gentlemen, we had fun. I really do appreciate you, Dennis. I hope people get your books, take the time to learn and read these things. And yeah, that was fun. We didn't cover everything all the way to the end, but I think we did a majority of that video and just kind of showed like, come on, give us a break here. But again, maybe and hopefully a trend of scholars, like many more, will come forward and start realizing I'm even though we're making mimesis more popular using MythVision, I do think it's going to be the decades coming. And as I would say, get less dogma amongst the academic world about how you can approach this material, you're probably going to find more scholars in time. Hopefully these institutions keep funding these areas, but that they come forward and start to back up and figure out new ways. I know Tim Whitmarsh has a publication in 2025, he said, coming out, so this year, that is why the Gospels were so received in the classical Greco-Roman world. And he didn't tell me why in his email, but he left me hanging. And I was like, why? You know, because I think he's going to get into emulation, imitation, and how it probably looks somewhat like what we're seeing with the classical Greek world. I don't know, complete guess, but I told him we got an interview on his new book when it comes out.
Well, I depend a lot on Tim Whitmarsh's work. And in my favorite work of his, the subtitle is The Politics of Imitation. And he then says in his introduction that the way that ancients crafted their identities was through rewriting of literature, that mimesis is not simply an artistic project, it's a sociological project. It's a way of talking about how your culture is different from another culture. And that's what Virgil does in the Aeneid. He's trying to show on the supremacy of Aeneas and Augustus over Greek heroes. So I'm excited about what Whitmarsh does, and I would actually, we served on a doctoral committee together, and that was for Richard Miller. He and I were on the same committee with Richard Miller. So I'm looking forward to what Whitmarsh is going to give us.
Same here. I really seriously appreciate everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. Again, Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald, the legend, the living legend. We need to set up temples all over the United States for you right now, Dennis. When you're dead, within 24 to 48 hours, me and Richard Miller will be walking on a road. I'm sure you're going to appear to us after you die. And we'll witness your ascension with a natural phenomena, and we'll have a cult surrounding your particular Mimesis Criticism, if that's okay with you, sir.
No. I've got a different image for you.
Oh, yeah?
No. I'm simply a beggar who found bread and wants to share it. Okay? I'm not divine. I stumbled upon this methodology and these parallels, and I find them so nourishing that I want to share this nourishment with others.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, case you do forget, never forget. We are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.